More than 800 years of conflicts, betrayals, and battles. What is this rivalry that shaped the world? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and each video immerses you in the fate of those who have shaped the world. Today, prepare to cross the veil of time and delve into the depths of a titanic conflict, a duel of empires that has shaped the destiny of the Western world. Over the centuries, between wavering thrones, raging seas, and battlefields, two powers have waged a relentless struggle. More than 8 centuries of hostility, conquests, and betrayals. From crusades to colonies, from the plains of Europe to the forests of America, their confrontation is played out as much in the clash of arms as in the silence of chancelleries. Wars, blockades, espionage, revolts. They have tried everything to dominate, ruin, and erase each other from the map. Between royal pride and popular fury, commerce and crusades, this millennial rivalry has become the backbone of European history. And what if the longest war in history had never really ended? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you and have a nice trip. Around the year 1000, medieval Western Europe is part of a vast network of exchanges and influences linking different regions of the globe. At this time, China is dominated by the Song dynasty, renowned for its technological innovations and commercial prosperity. Further west, the Fatimid Caliphate controls Egypt and part of the Near East, while the Ghaznavid Empire extends into Central Asia and northern India. In Africa, the Sahel is home to several powerful kingdoms, notably Ghana and Kanem, which thrive on the trans-Saharan trade of salt and gold. In southern India, the Chola Empire promotes Tamil culture's expansion throughout the Indian Ocean, managing to establish trade links with the Arabian Peninsula and Southeast Asia. In this multipolar world, the West is just a segment of a global whole in full mutation, where the circulation of ideas, goods, and techniques keeps increasing. The end of the first millennium in Europe is marked by a gradual stabilization after a wave of invasions. The Vikings, originating from Scandinavia, have raided many coasts since the 8th century, plundering monasteries and port cities. The Magyars, ancestors of the Hungarians, have launched incursions through Central and Western Europe before settling in the Danube basin. These upheavals weakened the Carolingian kingdoms, favoring the emergence of new local powers and the rooting of an early form of feudalism. In this context, the papacy seeks to strengthen its spiritual and temporal authority, initiating the Gregorian reform, which aims, among other things, to restore ecclesiastical discipline and liberate the church from secular influence. Meanwhile, the European population experiences a slight demographic recovery, supported by agricultural gains and a relative pacification of the countryside. This period sees the appearance of better organized dioceses, while monasteries become centers of culture. Agricultural production progresses thanks to several technical innovations that transform peasant life. The heavy plow, equipped with a mold board capable of turning the soil deeply, allows the exploitation of new areas with difficult soil. Coupled with the shoulder collar, which replaces the old frontal yoke, it increases the efficiency of animal traction and facilitates the expansion of cultivated areas. At the same time, the multiplication of hydraulic mills provides more regular mechanical energy for grinding grain or running rudimentary sawmills. The increased use of iron, notably for shoeing horses and making more resistant tools, significantly changes the rhythm of agricultural work. In the countryside, these changes are accompanied by a reorganization of the workforce as serfs and free peasants group into small communities required to pay fees and perform labor for their lords. The increased productivity gradually strengthens the demographic dynamic and establishes a sense of relative prosperity, particularly in the West. Far from being limited to a strictly continental framework, Europe already maintains trade relations with the outside world. Very ancient trade routes connect the Mediterranean regions with the lands of the East, conveying silks from China, spices from India, or Arabian incense. On the coasts of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, the trade of salt, wheat, and especially slaves remains a major stake, even as the Church begins to question the practice of Christian slavery. The Venetian and Genoese merchants active in the Mediterranean participate in the early forms of merchant capitalism, while prosperous communes like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres emerge in Flanders. It is also at this time that merchant city-states with charters of autonomy develop in northern Italy, forming the first embryos of urban governance. Thus, the West gradually connects to a larger market. Caravans and fairs stimulate this expansion. In Western society of the year 1000, the sense of belonging remains tied to personal and dynastic ties rather than to the modern notion of nation. Great lords and kings surround themselves with vassals, to whom they grant lands in exchange for military services and political assistance. Loyalty is defined above all by the oath of homage to the suzerain, and allegiances can fluctuate according to marriages, inheritances, or conflicts between rival lords. Linguistic distinctions between Romance, Germanic, or Slavic languages begin to emerge, but national consciousness remains almost non-existent. Dynasties, on the other hand, perceive themselves as guarantors of order and prosperity, relying on their family ties to consolidate their authority. In this fragmented world, religious identity also plays an essential role, with the Church asserting itself as the cultural glue of Christian West. However, each region retains its peculiarities, fueling local tensions. At the turn of the millennium, the Catholic religion permeates all aspects of life in the West. Bishops exercise considerable influence, not only in the spiritual domain but also in the administration of cities and the resolution of local conflicts. Monasteries serve as knowledge centers where ancient manuscripts are copied, thus preserving fragments of ancient culture. Abbeys, often founded by lords to bolster their prestige, become centers of prayer and agricultural production. Pilgrimages are on the rise, notably to Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem for the more daring. The simple faithful, subjected to a hierarchical social order, aspire to the salvation of their souls and rely on the authority of the clergy. Thus, the Church progressively consolidates its role as guardian of consciences and moral arbiter. Solemn liturgies and religious festivals pace the calendar, reinforcing community cohesion. On a political scale, the old Carolingian frameworks have just shattered, giving way to a mosaic of counties, duchies, and ecclesiastical principalities. Local dynasties attempt to consolidate their power, often by competing with larger lords endowed with vast domains. Feudal homage defines the relationship between suzerain and vassal, each party seeking to maximize its influence through matrimonial alliances or territorial gains. Kings such as Hugh Capet in France or Emperor Otto III in the Holy Roman Empire struggled to exert firm control over all their subjects. Assemblies of nobles and bishops meet to settle disputes, reflecting a still fluid mode of governance. Meanwhile, Saxon or Burgundian princes, for example, negotiate directly with the Church to strengthen their legitimacy. In this landscape, royal authority remains fragile and dependent on networks of loyalty. However, traditions continue to shape order. Daily life varies according to social rank and the region of Europe. In the rural world, the majority of the population works the land, living in villages with houses made of wood or wattle and daub, often situated around a church. The peasants primarily cultivate cereals, raise a few animals, and pay various taxes or tithes to the local lord. Artisans, who are rarer, specialize in the production of tools, textiles, or ceramics. In commercial towns, a class of merchants emerges, profiting from the trade of goods such as wheat, wine, or wool. The nobles, for their part, reside in fortified manors or simple wooden towers, exerting their authority over the local armed force and justice. The knight, a rising military figure, distinguishes himself by his expensive equipment and an honor code, still nascent but already valued. They embody a warrior ideal. In the year 1066, England stands at a decisive crossroads in its history. The Anglo-Saxon dynasties, which have ruled until then, face strong pressures following the death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066. Among the claimants to the crown, William, Duke of Normandy, asserts a family connection and the promise that Edward had given him the succession. However, it is Harold Godwinson, a powerful English earl, who is crowned king. This proclamation incites William's anger and precipitates his decision to raise an invasion army. The international context is then marked by multiple local and regional rivalries in Europe, but it is in the English Channel that a battle with major consequences for the history of what will become medieval England takes place. The Norman crossing is methodically prepared. William gathers ships, calls upon vassals from Normandy and neighboring territories, and seals military alliances by promising conquered lands. This vast invasion project mobilizes numerous resources, as it is necessary to ensure the transport of men, horses, and provisions across a strait known for its tides and shifting winds. The decisive battle takes place on October 14th, 1066, near the village of Hastings in southern England. Harold's Anglo-Saxon forces, already weakened by a previous confrontation against Norwegian invaders in the north of the country, face William's well-equipped and well-commanded Norman army. Under the banner of heavy cavalry, a key element of Norman military power, William's men employ tactics then less common in England, such as the combined use of archers and cavalry. The Anglo-Saxons, positioned in a shield wall, lack arrows and fresh men to hold their position. For several hours, the two lines fiercely oppose each other, but the discipline and feudal structure of the Normans eventually prevail. Harold himself is killed in battle, according to tradition, by an arrow received in the eye. This loss crushes the immediate resistance and opens the way to the conquest of the kingdom, launching a process that will durably transform England's political and social structures. William, now dubbed the Conqueror, then advances towards London. Taking advantage of the power vacuum created by the death of the Anglo-Saxon king, he obtains the submission of several great English lords who, understanding the unfavorable situation, seek to preserve all or part of their domains. To assert his authority, William is crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066 at Westminster Abbey. This event, described pompously by the chroniclers of the time, marks a turning point. Not only does a Norman duke become a full-fledged monarch, but he introduces in England the customs and feudal system practiced in Normandy. Quickly, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy is set aside in favor of a Franco-Norman aristocracy. Fiefs are distributed to William's companions as a reward for their loyalty on the battlefield. These new elites maintain close ties with Normandy, as many preserve lands and titles there, forming a vast family network on both sides of the Channel. Beyond the redistribution of land, this conquest leads to a major evolution of law and administration in England. William imports the feudal law of Frankish origin, which he adapts to the local context. While under the Anglo-Saxon kings, land ownership operated on different bases, and administrative management relied on counties headed by ealdormen, a kind of governors. The new organization favors the vassal regime, where each lord swears allegiance to the king, and in return, receives the enjoyment of an estate. Furthermore, The Languedoc, spoken in Normandy and in northern France, becomes the preferred language at the court and in the administration. Gradually, this French linguistic influence will take root, so much so that English will evolve by incorporating a large number of words of Romance origin. This period also sees the emergence of strong symbols of Norman power, such as the construction of stone fortresses, like the Tower of London, erected on the foundations of an ancient Roman fortification. This keep, designed by William, serves both as a residence and a defensive post dominated by the White Tower, a symbol of the new royal authority. On the ground, the transition does not occur without friction. The Anglo-Saxons, removed from power positions and dispossessed of their lands, do not easily accept swearing allegiance to these new Franco-Norman masters. Several uprisings break out in the northern regions of England, particularly in the York area. William responds with fierce repression, carried out during campaigns nicknamed the Harrying of the North or the Harrowing of the North. Vast territories are burned, and the populations are sometimes decimated or forced into exile. These actions leave a lasting mark on memories, as the social and economic landscape of certain regions is destroyed, while Norman control strengthens in the south and around major communication routes. To firmly establish this authority, it is crucial to know precisely the kingdom's resources and the fiscal potential it can provide. It is with this objective in mind that the Domesday Book is ordered in 1085, an exhaustive register that records nearly all the lands, people, and goods of the kingdom. The expression Domesday refers to the Last Judgment, the idea being that no land and no goods escape royal control. In this manuscript, precise information is found regarding the distribution of estates, their owners, and their fiscal value. For the time, this is a gigantic statistical enterprise, which mobilizes many local investigators tasked with collecting the declarations of inhabitants and lords. The lands held by the Anglo-Saxons who supported Harold before the Battle of Hastings are largely confiscated and redistributed to supporters of the new regime. The barons appointed by William gain substantial power, but they remain liable for military service and taxes to the crown. This feudal structure reinforces William's hold, establishing a base of loyalists upon which his successors can rely. Alongside political and land changes, the church also undergoes a profound transformation under the impetus of the Cluniac Reform. This movement, which appeared at the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy around the beginning of the 10th century, aims to strengthen monastic discipline, combat simony, the trafficking of sacred objects and ecclesiastical charges, and Nicolaism, the non-respect of priestly celibacy. The Norman rulers, including William himself, are often sensitive to these reforms, as they allow strengthening their authority by overseeing the local clergy. Bishops installed in England after the conquest are frequently from France, or trained in monasteries that have adopted this reform. The prestige of Canterbury, the seat of the primate Archbishop of England, is reaffirmed, yet the influence of Rome also becomes more pressing, as the papacy supports the reform. In this game of alliances, the investiture controversy, which pits the Pope against the German Emperor regarding the appointment of bishops, reverberates even in England. The Norman rulers intend to maintain a say in ecclesiastical appointments, whereas the Pope demands absolute independence for the Church in this matter. At the turn of the 12th century, Archbishop Anselm of Aosta, a renowned scholar and theologian, finds himself at the heart of these conflicts. Born in 1033, in the Duchy of Aosta, currently in northern Italy, Anselm was educated at the prestigious Abbey of Bec in Normandy, before becoming Archbishop of Canterbury. He supported the Cluniac reform and defended papal primacy, thus opposing the Norman king's desire to control appointments within the Church of England. several tensions arose, leading Anselm to periods of exile. His theological works, which would leave a lasting legacy, like his work on the existence of God, the famous ontological argument, are set in this turbulent context where political intrigues, power struggles, and religious fervor are intertwined. The debates around the role of the Pope in England further highlight the uniqueness of the Anglo-Norman monarchy, which oscillates between national Christian traditions and continental influence. Meanwhile, the emerging rivalry between England and Normandy is not limited to the spiritual realm. The cross-channel family networks are essential to the survival and expansion of the Norman king's power. Strategic marriages, vassalage ties, and trade exchanges are multiplying to consolidate a political space that spans both sides of the channel. The nobility thus constituted often has estates in Normandy, sometimes for several generations, and profits from these lands to finance its military operations or lifestyle in England. Conversely, the increased wealth of the English kingdom, thanks to its agriculture and certain import taxes, benefits Normandy, where the dukes continue to maintain castles and fortifications. This cross-channel entanglement is unprecedented. It engenders a seigneurial class, speaking mostly the langue d'oil, while administrating an English-speaking people that remain mostly rural. Under the reign of William's successors, notably William Rufus William II and Henry I, the Norman grip remains strong. William II continued his father's policies, fighting against the recent barons' revolts who sought greater independence. He died in 1100 under mysterious circumstances during a hunting party in the New Forest. It is then Henry I, another son of William the Conqueror, who seized the throne. He too faced internal contestations and the hostility of some barons, especially in Normandy, where his brother Robert Curthose, the eldest of the siblings, claimed ducal authority. The Battle of Tinchebray in 1106 saw Henry III's victory over his brother, consolidating the reunion of the Crown of England and the Duchy of Normandy under one scepter. This unification bestowed Henry with considerable prestige, reinforced by his sense of administration and the establishment of a system of royal justice that already foreshadowed the future common law. Toward the end of his life, Henry III faced a succession crisis. His son and heir, William Adelin, perished in 1120 during the sinking of the White Ship near Barfleur. Without a male heir, Henry designated his daughter Matilda, known as Empress Matilda, already widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, as his successor. However, upon the king's death in 1135, Stephen of Blois, a nephew of William the Conqueror, seized the throne, sparking a civil war that would last nearly 2 decades. This period, often called the Anarchy, is marked by instability and the multiplication of small feudal conflicts. The barons took advantage of the uncertainty to strengthen their own positions, building or enlarging their castles, aligning sometimes with Matilda, sometimes with Stephen. Destruction and plundering afflicted the kingdom, while Normandy was itself agitated, as Matilda's supporters claimed she was the legitimate heir. This duality between England and Normandy thus continually shaped the destiny of the monarchy. At the heart of these confrontations, the dynastic rivalry is coupled with ecclesiastical and diplomatic stakes. Bishops, often involved in the management of estates and the resolution of conflicts, must navigate with sovereigns who seek to control their resources. Meanwhile, the papacy remains attentive to appointments and attempts to maintain the Cluniac reform as well as papal authority. Contemporary historians see in these decades the seed of a persistent opposition. The idea of an English crown often turned towards Normandy, or even towards other territories, and a papacy eager to extend its influence over all of Christendom. Ecclesiastical offices thus become both a financial and spiritual stake, and the archbishoprics of Canterbury and York remain centers of power, difficult to fully control. Civil war gradually comes to an end when a compromise arises. In 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford finally grants Matilda and her lineage the prospect of one day ascending the throne, while Stephen is recognized as king until his death. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, subsequently claims the succession. He is already Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy by maternal inheritance, and he marries Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, thereby inheriting a vast portion of southwestern France. His ascent to the English throne in 1154 marks the official end of the so-called Norman period and the entry into what historians call the Plantagenet reign, inaugurating a new era where possessions on the continent and the Kingdom of England become more closely linked than ever before. The rivalry born in 1066 between the heirs of William and the former Anglo-Saxon nobility has transformed itself both into a profound institutional upheaval and into a game of international alliances that foreshadows centuries of tensions and conflicts between England and the dynasties ruling over French territories. The importation of Franco-Norman feudal law, the establishment of the Old French language and administration, and cross-channel marriages have durably shaped a new Anglo-Norman civilization. In this mosaic, the Church, driven by the Cluniac reform, played a role of cement, sometimes also a role of opposition, according to the royal and papal ambitions. Monuments such as the Tower of London, the drafting of the Domesday Book, and the proliferation of stone castles throughout the country testify to the imprint left by this conquest on insular society. The events from 1066 to 1154 thus became the backdrop against which the contours of a deep dynastic rivalry gradually emerged, fueled by territorial stakes that would only expand over time. Henry II's accession to the English throne in 1154 marks a major upheaval for the English monarchy. Heir to the County of Anjou and married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he receives a set of territories stretching from Normandy to the southern limits of Gascony. This vast domain His new power, termed the Plantagenet Empire, rests on a unique combination of principalities spread between England, Anjou, Normandy, and Aquitaine. At this time, feudal ties, matrimonial rights, and successions follow one another, giving birth to an entity as disparate as it is ambitious and unified. Henry II's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, formerly married to Louis VII, consolidates a remarkable territorial ensemble. Aquitaine, a flourishing wine region, harbors allies among the local nobility. Its riverine trade posts ensure fruitful commercial exchanges, strengthening the ruling couple's authority over these southern lands. To maintain the cohesion of this composite empire, Henry II implements significant administrative reforms. The Assizes of Clarendon, adopted in 1166, enhanced the royal prerogative in criminal justice. Itinerant officers now traverse the country, enforcing the sovereign's order everywhere. The scutage, a new tax designed to replace the military obligation of vassals, also demonstrates this desire to centralize resources. Rather than serve themselves in the royal army, barons can pay a tax that feeds the treasury, funding campaigns and essential infrastructures. In this context, the figure of Thomas Becket emerges as one of the main protagonists. Initially chancellor and close friend of Henry II, he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Rapidly, he defends the autonomy of the Church against royal encroachments, provoking a resounding rift with the monarch. The confrontation reaches its climax when Becket, forced into exile, insists on the independence of the clergy from secular laws. Henry II, irritated, exclaims at a banquet that he wishes to get rid of this troublesome prelate. Zealous knights interpret the order and assassinate Becket in 1170. Having become a martyr, Thomas Becket enjoys immense prestige in Europe. At the French court, the brutal attitude of Henry II is denounced, presented as an unmanageable overlord. Chroniclers of the Capetian kingdom seize the affair, reinforcing the idea that an English monarch can be excessive and domineering. During this period, France is governed by Louis VII, then by his son Philip II, called Philip Augustus. Convinced of the necessity of containing Plantagenet expansion, the latter attentively observes Henry II's internal difficulties, notably the tensions between the king and his sons. At Henry II's death in 1189, Richard the Lionheart succeeds him. A charismatic warrior, Richard spends little time in England, preferring to participate in the Third Crusade alongside the King of France and the German Emperor in order to reconquer Jerusalem. However, his prolonged absence weakens the Plantagenet administration and fuels the ambitions of Philip Augustus. The Capetian monarch draws closer to the lords of the Midi and Flanders, seeking to isolate the English king. Meanwhile, John Lackland, Richard's brother, maneuvers to increase his power. When Richard is captured on his way back from the Crusade and imprisoned in Germany, Philip Augustus adds the alliance of Toulouse, hoping to fracture the Angevin inheritance. Despite a heavy ransom, Richard manages to recover his rank and resumes active warfare against France. The unexpected death of Richard in 1199 then places John Lackland on the throne of England. He inherits a complex situation. Anglo-French relations deteriorate. The Anglo-Norman aristocracy worries about his fluctuating authority, and Eleanor of Aquitaine remains attached to certain familial prerogatives still inherited. Philip Augustus, as a keen observer, sees an opportunity to break the Anglo-Angevin power. He bets on alliances in the Midi, seeking to isolate John. Political configurations evolve rapidly, and the King of France swiftly exploits the administrative gaps left by Richard's disappearance. In the north, Philip Augustus draws closer to the Counts of Flanders to raise funds. The rich cloth cities, like Bruges or Ghent, offer significant financial support to the French military operations, while John struggles to consolidate loyal relations in England and reinforce the army. In John Lackland's entourage, suspicion grows. Some Norman barons, frustrated by the new king's fluctuating policy, maintain links with the French court. Philip Augustus stirs these divisions, promising to respect privileges and fiefs in case of rallying to his cause. To thwart these ambitions, John attempts to concentrate his forces in Normandy. He relies on fortified castles, symbols of the ducal heritage, hoping to maintain a line of defense. However, the lack of cohesion within his army slows his actions and favors the French initiative. Château Gaillard, located on the Seine, then stands as the defensive jewel of Normandy. Built at the end of Richard the Lionheart's reign, this edifice overlooks the valley and makes any frontal assault perilous. Yet, Philip Augustus is determined to breach this impregnable fortress. Through meticulous preparation and the use of siege engines, the Capetian army manages to encircle Château Gaillard. Provisions become scarce, the garrison exhausts itself, and rescue attempts fail. In 1204, the stronghold falls, paving the way for the reconquest of Normandy. This victory seals the end of an era where the King of England dominated lands on the continent. From now on, the Plantagenets lose most of Normandy, marking the reduction of their empire. The balance of power shifts in favor of the Capetian monarchy, consolidating its authority. In the territories still under English control, the local nobility reacts differently to the loss of Normandy. Some turn to the English court, reaffirming loyalty and hoping for a future restoration. Others seek a compromise with Philip Augustus, eager to maintain their seigneurial rights and feudal liberties. The political reconfiguration also affects the church, as several bishoprics, once under English authority, must renegotiate their status. The archbishops seek to preserve their ties with Canterbury, while Philip Augustus encourages integration into the orbit of Reims. This tension reflects the rivalry between the two powers. Despite everything, the legal footprint of the Angevin Empire remains strong in England. The assizes of Clarendon and the principle of itinerant justice survive, while scutage endures as a preferred source of funding for the crown. Such measures consolidate the foundations of the English state still. For his part, the Capetian monarchy asserts its authority in the Norman region. Royal agents take control of the castles recovered, establish a tax system, and strengthen ties with the local aristocracy. This consolidated royal domain strengthens the position of the King of France in Europe. However, John Lackland does not immediately renounce his claims. He still hopes to rally some support among the lords near the Loire or expand his base in Gascony. Nevertheless, the reality on the ground increasingly leans in favor of Philip Augustus. Control of the Channel, the artery between England and the continent, figures among the points of this confrontation. Henry II had established a network of fortified ports, but the French military dynamic in the Norman Duchy reduces these accesses, weakening English trade. On the diplomatic front, Philip Augustus secures the support of the Count of Toulouse in exchange for guarantees on Languedoc, a region coveted for its merchant riches. Likewise, he nurtures his relations with the German emperor, ensuring that John Lackland receives no reinforcements. The last supporters of John hope for an English resurgence, but the death of many Norman knights and the weariness of the lords weaken his position. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine, aged, cannot influence the course of operations. The Capetian reconquest progresses, confirming the ongoing geopolitical shift. Beyond the military, the fall of Chateau Gaillard and the loss of Normandy mark a turning point in identities. The King of France establishes himself as the guarantor of feudal rights in the region, while the English nobility begins to turn back to its traditions. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Capetian dynasty, seated on the throne of France, consolidates its authority over a territory expanded over the previous decades. Across the Channel, the Plantagenet dynasty attempts to preserve its continental possessions, inherited especially through the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine with Henry II of England. After the reconquest of Normandy by Philip Augustus in 1204, the balance of power changes drastically as the King of France gradually imposes his sovereignty over former Angevin, Norman, and Poitevin lands. This dynamic provokes the anger of the English sovereigns and their allies, particularly in the German Empire and Flanders, where the economic rise of textile cities partly relies on English wool. The accumulated rivalries lead to a major confrontation in 1214 during the Battle of Bouvines. In that year, 1214, the King of France, Philip II, nicknamed Philip Augustus, faces a coalition formed by the Roman-German Emperor Otto IV, Count Ferrand of Flanders, and the King John of England, known as John Lackland. The English ally hopes, by launching military operations in different areas, to force the King of France to disperse his troops. In the north, near the village of Bouvines, it is ultimately a single confrontation that decides the fate of the campaign as the Royal French cavalry and infantry, united behind Philip Augustus, succeed in blocking and defeating the German-Flemish coalition. The battle highlights the tactical skill of the French knights, arranged in coordinated lines of combat. Supporters of the Capetian monarchy quickly transform this victory into a founding event. In cities and monasteries, this triumph is celebrated through tales glorifying the unity of the people around their king. Some historians consider Bouvines as one of the first moments where the consciousness of a French nation begins to germinate, even if the idea of a nation, in the modern sense, is still far from clearly defined. Thus, the battle contributes to the construction of a nascent national myth on the French side. On a political level, the defeat of the coalition has considerable repercussions, particularly for the King of England, John Lackland. Not well liked by his barons, he has already lost Normandy and suffered several defeats against the Capetians. His authority emerges further weakened from this episode because he could not offer the victory and territorial expansion that some English lords expected. This royal weakening violently manifests the following year, in 1215, when part of the high English nobility rises to impose on the sovereign a major document, the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. Signed at Runnymede, near Windsor, this charter limits the king's power, protects certain feudal rights, and establishes legal principles, such as the embryonic habeas corpus, the idea that no one can be arrested or detained without a legal reason. The barons are powerful enough to force John Lackland to yield, but the charter will regularly be challenged, even annulled, before being gradually reaffirmed. Despite the fluctuations, the essential is that the principle of limiting royal prerogatives is now established. In this context of tensions, England finds itself weakened, especially since the French rivals are sometimes suspected of supporting certain rebellious barons. John Lackland, seeking to restore his authority, is ready to use any means of pressure. On their side, the Capetians know how to handle diplomacy and psychological warfare, particularly by playing on the detention of important prisoners, members of the high English aristocracy, or allies of the Plantagenets. When it comes to members close to the royal family, these captives become major political stakes. Tensions remain high, each camp hoping to achieve the release of its hostages, or, conversely, to ensure the maintenance of a certain ascendancy over the adversary by keeping royal captives. In some cases, temporary truces are agreed upon to negotiate the release of princesses or ladies from the English court, used as bargaining chips to exert pressure on the King of England. The following decades see the emergence of a significant figure on the French side, Louis IX, whom history will remember as Saint Louis. Crowned in 1226, while still a child, this sovereign grows under the regency of his mother, Blanche of Castile. As he asserts his majority, he develops a policy of royal justice and internal peace, while remaining aware of the persistent tensions with England. Deeply pious and eager to consolidate his authority, he is committed to the idea of papal arbitration when it comes to settling conflicts with the great European princes. Louis IX maintains a continuous correspondence with the Pope, seeking to legitimize his decisions and stabilize the kingdom. In medieval tradition, the King of France is considered the eldest son of the Church, an honorary title that underscores his close ties with Rome and the clerical spheres. Toward the middle of the 13th century, the papacy becomes involved in putting an end to the rivalries between the Capetian crown and that of England. After episodes of confrontation and successive negotiations, the treaties of Paris, 1258 and 1259, are reached. Through these agreements, Louis IX endeavors to clarify the feudal situation in Aquitaine, where English possessions have extended since the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine. One of the crucial points of these treaties lies in the cession of the Agenais, a strategic territory at the crossroads between southwestern France and the heart of English Guyenne. Officially, the King of England recognizes the suzerainty of the King of France over these lands, even though he retains several fiefs of substantial income. In return, the Duke of Guyenne, also titled King of England, pays homage to the French sovereign for the continental part of his domains. The homage is a feudal ritual in which the vassal, kneeling or standing before his lord, swears allegiance and promises to defend the interests of the latter. Its symbolic meaning is major. It reminds that, even if the King of England reigns overseas, he remains theoretically subject to the King of France for his territories located in continental Europe. Behind these diplomatic stakes lies a confrontation between two military and cultural systems. In the Capetian camp, chivalry has developed significantly. The institution of knighting, a ceremony that turns a young noble into a knight, is accompanied by a code of conduct valuing bravery, loyalty, and piety. Knights, fighting on horseback and protected by armor, form the backbone of the French army. They are often supported by urban militias, equivalent to light infantry, recruited from communes under royal authority. Across the English Channel, there is the evolution of an older system, the fyrd, which, since Anglo-Saxon times, referred to the militia levy in each county. In the 13th century, this fyrd is revamped to include fighting lords and a higher proportion of archers, whose effectiveness would become legendary in the next century during the 100 Years' War. At this point, English archers are not yet systematically decisive against the French heavy cavalry, but the idea of a long-distance strike force is developing in the British Isles, so we can already see the beginnings of new strategies. In the chivalric culture of this era, courtesy plays a central role. It ensures the respect of certain unspoken rules even on the battlefield, frames the exchange of prisoners, and sometimes prescribes attitudes of clemency towards noble adversaries. On the sidelines of conflicts, festive gatherings perpetuate these values. Among them, the Tournament of Chauvency, which usually takes place in the latter half of the 13th century, presents itself as a spectacular display of medieval courtesy. Organized in Lorraine under the aegis of prominent lords, it hosts renowned knights from various regions, including Flanders, Champagne, and northern France. Far from being a simple game, the tournament stages a blend of martial skill and refined rituals. Jousting on horseback, melee, presentations in armor before the court ladies, sumptuous banquets, and minstrel songs. Chroniclers often emphasize the splendor of the shields, the bright colors of the banners, and the mottos, short symbolic phrases shouted by the combatants when entering the arena. The poems and narratives written on the occasion extol prowess, loyalty, and courtly love, while highlighting the nobility of those who offer hospitality and contribute to the event's success. In this context, the Tournament of Chauvency is also a tool of princely propaganda, as it publicly projects the values that great lords wish to embody or promote. By inviting distant knights, They demonstrate the court's power of attraction and the quality of the hospitality reserved for nobles coming from England, as well as the continent. Marital alliances and peace negotiations are sometimes woven behind the scenes of these festivals, between two jousts simulating combat. For princes, it's an opportunity to strengthen ties that might prove useful in times of more serious tensions. It's also a theater where the bravery of French and English contingents is compared through chivalrous gestures without jeopardizing the already precarious diplomatic balance. In 1294, the political landscape of Western Europe transformed significantly. The King of France, Philip IV, known as the Fair, seeks to strengthen his authority over all territories under the crown, notably Guyenne, also called Aquitaine, an English possession since the 12th century due to dynastic marriages and intertwined inheritances. Guyenne is then under the control of the English monarchy, represented by Edward I, before his son, Edward II, and then his grandson, Edward III, successively inherit it. This region, located in the southwest of the Kingdom of France, holds a strategic position, both economically and for the prestige of the English sovereigns, who nevertheless must pay homage to the King of France in his capacity as suzerain. This feudal dependency hurts the pride of the English crown, and the tensions, sometimes postponed by occasional treaties, eventually intensify over the years. Customs crises in Bordeaux are part of this climate. Bordeaux, a major port in Guyenne, is a true commercial crossroads. The wine from this region is conquering the markets in England, and local taxation, notably the customs and taxes imposed on goods, becomes a pivotal point. English merchants complain about the burden of these taxes, while the French royalty seeks to increase its revenues to fund its projects and consolidate its power. Trans-channel trade, essential to the economic prosperity of Guyenne, becomes complicated when Philip IV introduces new customs measures to gain more control over the wine trade and the movement of goods to England. This policy discontents the English, who see their profits diminish and their sovereign losing face by being forced to negotiate on matters concerning mere taxes. Tensions quickly rise between the two courts, culminating in a French raid against an English fleet stationed at the end of the 13th century. This military show of force aims to remind that Guyenne is part of the Kingdom of France, and that in case of commercial disagreement, the King of France can employ force. This direct conflict, although occasional, foreshadows a broader divergence concerning sovereignty in Guyenne. The ambiguous status of this territory, a vassal of a supposedly inferior king, but a king of England with asserted ambitions, is one of the deep causes of the discord. Furthermore, the dynastic question exacerbates this situation, as the Capetian succession becomes the heart of a major dispute. Explaining the Salic law is fundamental to understanding the issue. This law, of Merovingian origin, stipulates that the crown of France cannot pass through women. The Capetians, eager to legitimize their lineage and avoid a transfer of power outside the kingdom, invoke this rule to dismiss potential claimants from other families. When Philip IV dies in 1314, his inheritance goes to his sons, and following the successive demise of these direct heirs, attention turns to Philip of Valois, who becomes king under the name of Philip VI in 1328. However, Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV, through his mother Isabella of France, also claims the throne. He contests the logic of the Salic law, considering that his lineage through Isabella should open the way to the crown of France for him. The Capetians, arguing that she has no right to the throne transmission, uphold the proclamation of Philip VI. This quarrel over succession is not limited to a simple debate among legal experts. It affects the prestige of families and raises the fundamental question of the sovereign's legitimacy. In medieval Europe, monarchy being the supreme institution, ruling by divine right, this challenge to Capetian legality leads to strong hostility between the Valois and Plantagenets. At the same time, economic alliances crisscross Europe, explaining why France and England are soon to be at war on a scale beyond just Guyenne. The drapery industry of Flanders, one of the most flourishing in Europe, depends almost entirely on wool imported from England. Flemish cities such as Bruges, Gand, and Ypres thrive on converting this wool into refined cloths. These city-states, led by powerful aldermen and wealthy patricians, ardently defend their freedom and seek to maintain good relations with London to secure their supply of raw materials. Conversely, the French monarchy wishes to place Flanders under tighter control, as this county lies within the direct influence zone of the French crown. The Counts of Flanders traditionally must pay homage to the King of France, but their economic power and commercial ties with the King of England complicate matters. In case of a Franco-English conflict, Flemish skippers, artisans, and merchants often side with England, as the prosperity of their trades depends on wool exports. A true division arises. On the one hand, a France striving to politically impose itself on Flanders, and on the other, an England attracting the wealthy Flemish cities by guaranteeing the continuity of their trade. This economic rivalry, coupled with political stakes, explains why Flanders becomes a secondary but crucial arena during the early clashes of what will erupt into open warfare in the 1330s. The passage of armies also plays a significant role as military geography becomes more precise. The fortifications of the Somme, this river in the north of France, begin to take on strategic importance. By controlling its bridges, fords, and castles, one can block the route for invasions coming from Flanders or the Empire, or conversely, facilitate an offensive against the county of Flanders. This border area is, in a way, the lock protecting Paris and the prosperous regions of the Paris Basin. The idea of borders at this time is still in its infancy, as medieval realities are more organized around feudal ties and intertwined lordships. However, from the 14th century onward, we see a desire to draw clearer boundaries and to fortify key positions on either side of the Somme. The aim is to prevent the rivalries among men-at-arms from turning into deep incursions into the kingdom. Monarchs become aware that well-defended and clearly defined border areas help better preserve their authority. Elites, whether secular or ecclesiastical, begin to mention the concept of the border in charters, ordinances, and diplomatic conferences. For the first time, there is an attempt to establish a true defensive line, embodying a monarch's sovereignty over a given space. The ideas of war and legitimacy are also being shaped in public opinion, although this term remains anachronistic for the period. Sermons preached in churches, the teachings of certain religious orders, and the writings of chroniclers and poets help build a vision of the conflict that will oppose France and England. Jean Froissart, a Franco-Belgian historian and chronicler active in the 14th century, is one of the most representative figures of this narrative construction. In his chronicles, he relies on testimonies and his own observations to report on battles, court intrigues, and royal ambitions. He describes in great detail the rivalry between the two crowns, highlighting the audacity of some, the bravery of others, thus creating an idealized image of medieval war. This literary form helps influence the mentality of nobles, clerics, merchants, or cultured bourgeois who do not necessarily have access to external events other than through the voice of preachers or chroniclers. Over time, this emerging sector of propaganda proves crucial for strengthening adherence to a cause and justifying the resort to arms. On a symbolic level, the lily and the leopard crystallize the confrontation. The lily, a flower adopted by the French royalty since the reign of Louis VII, occupies a massive place in the collective imagination. It embodies purity, the biblical Mary, and the legitimacy of the Capetian dynasty, Displayed on banners, seals, royal garments, it serves as a reminder that the King of France rules by divine right. In contrast, the English monarchs have long used the rampant lion as an emblem. In the mid-13th century, the coat of arms of the Plantagenet house was adorned with 3 lions or leopards in gold on a red field, symbolizing the strength and power of the dynasty since the era of Richard the Lionheart. These emblems aid in rallying the troops and are abundantly represented in illuminations, on battle standards, and in coats of arms sculpted into castle walls. The people, though mostly illiterate, become accustomed to recognizing their rulers with just a glance at the coat of arms. Thus, in the impending conflict, the French lily and the English leopard become living allegories of 2 sovereign claims in direct conflict. In this context, the proclamation of Edward III, when he inherits the English throne in 1327, deepens the discord with France. He embraces the desire to reaffirm English control over Guyenne and even dares to present himself in his letters as the legitimate heir to the French crown. To the court of Philip VI, this claim is an affront to feudal customs, even a barely veiled declaration of war. The kings of France and England then engage in negotiations, sometimes under the auspices of the Pope, to try to resolve their mutual grievances. They discuss the vassalage of the Duke of Guyenne, the rate of taxes on Bordeaux wine, the terms of wool exports, and of course, the dynastic issue. However, no lasting solution manages to calm the rivalry. Hopes for a truce often prove futile due to reciprocal pride and a political calculation that to yield when one is King of England or France would discredit him in the eyes of the great lords, always ready to challenge a monarchy seen as weak. This period, which runs until 1337, thus slowly prepares the ground for what will later be called the 100 Years' War. The populations in towns and in the countryside do not yet realize the scale of the coming conflict, but already feel the signs of danger. Taxes rising to support garrisons, rumors of battles announced, fear of seeing one's village caught on the route of a chevauchée. French nobles begin to increase the size of their retinues, their entourage of fighters. English barons, for their part, emphasize the effectiveness of their archers and the importance of their cavalry, convinced that they will be able to defeat even larger armies. Chroniclers already describe the rise of a feeling of mutual hostility, provoked by commercial disputes and reinforced by the prospect of a French throne snatched from the Valois. Diplomatic exchanges are made and undone, while the whole of Europe observes the evolution of this Franco-English quarrel. German princes, the Dukes of Burgundy, the Counts of Hainaut, the Lords of Flanders, and even the Pope of Avignon follow the situation closely, seeking to preserve their own interests. Marriage alliances multiply, each sovereign intending to secure the support of a neighbor or a cousin. This is how the great princely marriages, concluded at the end of banquets or under the authority of the Holy See, play a crucial role in stabilizing or destabilizing the border areas. Embassies travel the roads of continental Europe and connect London to Paris via Avignon, Bruges, or Cologne. The climate, already tense, slowly turns to generalized mistrust as neither court wishes to be caught off guard by a surprise attack. Tensions reach a new level when, on the eve of the 1330s, diplomatic and military incidents occur in the region of Guyenne. French garrisons are established in strongholds near the border, while English troops travel along the coast. English diplomats accuse France of wanting to annihilate the Anglo-Gascon economic power, while the French blame the English for plotting with the Flemings against the stability of the kingdom. The sermons of the mendicant friars, influential preachers in the great cities, add fuel to the fire by exalting the figure of the king as the defender of the faith and recalling the risks to the soul's salvation, if one defies legitimate authority. The texts of Jean Froissart, which begin to circulate in cultural circles, convey stories of national pride, although the concept of nation is not yet established as we understand it today. The lords, more literate than is sometimes imagined, are passionate about these chivalric tales and prepared to write new glorious chapters for their lineage. In this same momentum, the French royal officers, appointed by Philip VI, attempt to better administer the border regions. They endeavor to list the fiefs, demand oaths of allegiance, and collect special taxes for defense. The aim is to prevent certain lordships from joining the English cause or negotiating their autonomy during wartime. On the English side, calls to Parliament are multiplied, not only to vote for new taxes, but also to rally the barons around the throne. The English kings know they must gain the consent of the realm's great nobles to finance expeditions on the continent. Internal divergences of interest in England sometimes hinder royal action. Some barons primarily wish to secure their own domains. Others have naval or colonial ambitions and do not necessarily see the point in mobilizing a large contingent in Guyenne. Yet, the argument of sovereignty, coupled with the prestige of subduing the King of France, rallies part of the nobility, flattered to fight in the homeland of St. Louis and to attempt to rule over a kingdom reputed to be the richest in Europe. This fervor is reflected in the state of international commerce. Italian merchants, Genoese or Venetian, fear that a large conflict initially limited to France and England could disrupt their maritime routes. Hanseatic merchants, based in the Baltic and North Sea port cities, also assess the movements of ships and the potential danger to their cargoes. All sense that if France and England go to war, trade in Northern and Western Europe could become paralyzed, risking price hikes or even blockades. Despite this concern, some hope to take advantage of the situation by sending their galleys or caravels to less monitored ports, or speculating on the price of wool and wheat in the conflict zones. Thus, the ideological preparation of the conflict is coupled with an economic preparation, where everyone attempts to anticipate the outcome by betting on the victory of one sovereign or another. Gradually, the question of the Capetian succession and the dispute over Guyenne by France become the official causes of a latent war, commonly dated to begin in 1337. Edward III's claim, his refusal to pay homage to Philip VI, Anglo-Flemish trade alliances, increased surveillance of fortifications, and the rise of patriotic rhetoric fueled by the sermons and writings of Froissart all contribute to transforming a feudal dispute into a large-scale conflict. Both thrones are ready, convinced of the righteousness of their cause, and Europe holds its breath. From 1337, the tension that had been simmering for several decades between the English crown and the French monarchy turned into open conflict, marking the start of what would later be called the 100 Years' War. The origins of this disagreement partly stemmed from the complex feudal ties inherited from the time of the Plantagenets. Edward III, King of England since 1327, claimed the French throne through his mother, Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV the Fair. He saw in the death of Charles IV in 1328, the last surviving son of Philip IV, an opportunity to assert his rights. With the direct Capetian dynasty extinct, the new French sovereign, Philip VI of Valois, categorically rejected Edward III's claim. Furthermore, Guyenne region under English influence but theoretically a vassal of the French king served as a geopolitical pretext. The recognition of French suzerainty was perceived by the English as interference in their affairs. Diplomatic negotiations failed in a climate already tense from commercial rivalries surrounding wool exported from England to the textile workshops in Flanders. In the autumn of 1337, Philip VI pronounced the confiscation of Guyenne, triggering the spiral of war. The peasant populations of both kingdoms, unaccustomed to viewing war in terms of throne conquests, would suffer the first repercussions as the nobility and princely families began a struggle for influence on a European scale. At the beginning of the conflict, the French military power seemed theoretically superior. The Capetian monarchy had substantial demographic resources and benefited from a vast and relatively unified territory. French knights regarded themselves as the elite of Western cavalry, proud heirs of the Capetian era, with well-established military traditions. However, England compensated for its numerical inferiority with more coherent organization and innovative tactics. The English monarchs maintained a more disciplined professional army, in which longbow archery played a crucial role. Originating from Wales, these archers were capable of shooting their arrows over long distances and piercing heavy armor, posing a direct threat to the French cavalry when it launched frontal charges. Moreover, Edward III managed to forge alliances with German princes in certain Flemish cities, sometimes swayed by commercial arguments and promises of protection. As early as 1339, some skirmishes and English raids on French soil signaled the escalation of the conflict. The French attempted to respond by harassing English positions in Guyenne, but England, with its solid fleet, retained its advantage at sea. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was a major military turning point and one of the emblematic confrontations of the first phase of the Hundred Years' War. It took place near the town of Crécy-en-Ponthieu in northern France on August 26, 1346. Edward III, who had landed in Normandy with an army of nearly 15,000 to 20,000 men, was on French territory, intending to push Philippe VI to direct confrontation. The French, with 25,000 to 30,000 combatants, included the cream of the chivalry and experienced generals. Yet, despite this numerical superiority, the French army faced the discipline and meticulous preparation of the English. Edward III carefully chose his terrain, positioning his longbowmen on slopes that facilitated their shooting and protected their flanks. When the French knights launched their charges, they found themselves under a deluge of arrows that rendered their heavy armor ineffective. The horses, injured or frightened, created panic movements in the French ranks. This new tactic, centered on massive use of archery, highlighted the vulnerability of heavy cavalry against a well-organized infantry equipped with ranged weapons, elan. The French army suffered heavy losses, including several prominent members of the nobility, while King Philippe VI managed to leave the battlefield in extremis. Following the resounding victory at Crécy, the English army advanced towards the strategic port of Calais on the northern coast of France to undertake a siege lasting nearly a year from September 1346 to August 1347. Calais, a fortified city controlled by the French, represented a major logistical asset. Facing the English coast, the city could serve as a base for potential military or commercial operations across the Channel. The port's resources also allowed the English army to be supplied with food, weapons, and human reinforcements. Determined to take the city, Edward III set up in an entrenched camp encircling Calais with a large fortified perimeter. The defenders, led by Jean de Vienne, held out for a long time thanks to the strength of the walls and initial supplies. However, the English, aware of the city's strategic importance, maintained constant pressure, blocking all supply routes. After 11 months of strenuous siege, the inhabitants, stricken by famine and exhaustion, had to surrender. Calais thus fell entirely into English hands on August 3, 1347. Edward III largely expelled the local population and installed English-speaking settlers to consolidate his control. Henceforth, Calais became the cornerstone of English operations in France, allowing a direct and permanent link with the British Isles. During the war, an unexpected disaster struck the population and heavily affected both sides: the Black Death, which appeared in Europe around 1347. It spread rapidly and killed millions between 1348 and 1350. This pandemic, likely transmitted by fleas on black rats arriving aboard merchant ships, caused a dramatic demographic collapse. In some regions of the Kingdom of France, it is estimated that 1/3 or even half of the population perished. England also suffered heavy human losses, making it difficult to raise troops and collect regular war taxes. The countryside, already ravaged by military raids, found itself depopulated and unable to produce enough food to sustain the fighters. The massive mortality also affected the nobility and the high clergy, creating succession crises in several fiefs and weakening the royal administration, both in France and England. The finances of the French monarchy, already severely strained by the upkeep of garrisons and war ransoms, became even more fragile. The English government was not spared either. A sharp drop in the number of taxpayers crippled fiscal income, limiting Edward III's ability to finance his continental campaigns. The horror of the plague, combined with the atrocities and destruction of the war, cast an especially dark shadow over this period. Despite this catastrophe, hostilities did not cease. After the episode of the Black Death, Franco-English relations remained tense, and England hoped to further consolidate its gains. In this regard, the Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356, proved even more traumatic for the French monarchy than Crécy had been 10 years earlier. This time, the English command was led by Edward of Woodstock, the eldest son of Edward III, better known as the Black Prince, a nickname linked to the color of his armor. Having launched a new raid in the central west of France, he advanced to the Poitou region, hoping to destabilize the French defenses. King John II the Good, successor of Philip VI since 1350, hastily mobilized a considerable army to intercept the English. The French could have won due to their numerical superiority, but the command's anxiety, unfamiliarity with the terrain, and reliance on ineffective frontal assaults once again placed them in a catastrophic situation. The English longbowmen, strategically positioned, inflicted heavy losses, and the final English attack forced the French to rout. To top it all off, John II the Good was captured on the battlefield, a resounding event that shook the Kingdom of France far beyond the mere military failure. This capture of a king in person led to vast diplomatic and financial consequences. In France, the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles V, had to assume the regency and face not only the continuation of the war, but also internal revolts, such as the Great Jacquerie of 1358 and the insurrectional movements in Paris under the impetus of Etienne Marcel. While John II was held, negotiations began to define the terms of his release. England, in a position of strength, intended to capitalize on this situation to considerably expand its possessions and obtain a colossal ransom. The Black Prince, on his part, gained prestige, establishing himself as a feared and respected leader. Embassies followed one another to establish a provisional peace agreement. In this climate of uncertainty, France sought to reorganize its administration, to equip new armies, and maintain a semblance of internal stability. The French nobles, seeing their king imprisoned, worried about the state's ability to preserve royal authority, while the English, aware of their tactical advantage, hoped to force the outcome by imposing their territorial and financial demands. Diplomatic negotiations dragged on, punctuated by temporary armistices and threats of a large-scale resumption of hostilities. In 1360, England and France finally reached a compromise, the Treaty of Bretigny-Calais, signed on May 8th in Bretigny and confirmed in October in Calais. This treaty stipulated the release of John II the Good in exchange for the payment of a gigantic ransom, amounting to 3 million gold écus, a considerable sum for the time. In return, France had to cede to the English a vast territorial area, including the entirety of enlarged Aquitaine. Moreover, Edward III formally renounced his claim to the French crown, at least officially, as mutual resentment remained strong. The treaty's clauses also included the handing over of high-ranking hostages as a guarantee of payment. Despite this agreement, the effective implementation faced many challenges. Certain ceded cities refused to recognize English sovereignty, and the gradual payment of the ransom proved extremely burdensome for the already exhausted French royal finances. Faced with this financial challenge, the institutions of the Kingdom of France had to evolve considerably. To gather the necessary money, the monarchy implemented or strengthened several permanent tax levies, among them the gabelle, a tax on salt, and the feuillage, a tax levied on each household. Until then, direct taxation had mainly been of an exceptional nature in the context of a war or a crisis. After the Treaty of Bretigny-Calais in 1360, the Kingdom of France was slowly recovering from the crushing defeats suffered against the English troops during the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The territories conceded to England, particularly in Guyenne, weighed heavily on the political balance of the time, while the dynamism and desire for reconquest fueled the new generation of French leaders. Charles V, known as the Wise, succeeded John II the Good in 1364. He inherited a weakened but still resilient country. To restore royal authority, he relied on competent advisors and the emergence of an exceptional strategist, Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton from the minor nobility, versed in the realities of the era's combat. Recognized for his ability to command small garrisons and his skill in utilizing the terrain, du Guesclin embodied a new form of warfare. His appointment as Constable of France, that is to say, head of the royal armies, in 1370 marked the beginning of a long campaign of gradual reconquest of cities and fortresses that had fallen into English hands. This phase, sometimes referred to as the War of Skirmishes, relied on harassment tactics aimed at wearing down the enemy. Du Guesclin's military strategy contrasted with the large, decisive, but risky pitched battles of the first half of the conflict. Rather than confronting the enemy in open terrain, where the advantage seemed to lie with the English archers and their tactical organization, he favored localized operations. Thus, French companies would carry out lightning raids, supported by well-defended fortresses. This approach, less spectacular than rapid movement warfare, allowed for frequently surprising isolated enemy garrisons and maintaining pressure along the border, separating English possessions from the royal domain. Under Charles V, France gradually reconquered important positions in Normandy, Brittany, and the Loire Basin, fortifying strategic strongholds to prevent potential counter-offensives. While consolidating internal unity, the sovereign also relied on a centralized administration to regularly levy taxes. This taxation, although often unpopular, provided essential funds to arm and pay the troops, as well as to fortify citadels. Meanwhile, England was experiencing political turmoil that hampered its ability to intervene on the continent. The internal English crises are notably expressed through the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a major event that shakes the reign of the young Richard II. The peasants, exasperated by the fiscal pressure following the war in France and the attempt to impose a new polling system, rise up in several regions. They march on London and, under the leadership of figures such as Wat Tyler, openly challenge the authorities. Although the revolt is eventually suppressed, it reveals significant rifts in English society. The royal power appears less stable than it seems, especially when the nobility itself is divided by factional rivalries. Some historians consider that the social and political tensions of this period prefigure the Civil War that will later erupt in the 15th century, the infamous Wars of the Roses 1455-487, which will pit the House of Lancaster against the House of York. At the end of the 14th century, no one clearly perceives that a new internal succession war is brewing in England, but the warning signs are already visible. The English sovereigns then struggle to effectively mobilize their barons and knights to continue the offensive in France, which allows Charles V the opportunity to consolidate his positions. At the same time, the Western Church is experiencing a profound division. The Western Schism begins in 1378, when the cardinals elect a pope in Rome, Urban VI, while part of the Cardinal College contests this election and chooses an anti-pope who will sit in Avignon, under the influence of the King of France. This unprecedented situation, with 2 and even 3 rival popes, plunges Latin Europe into confusion and creates diplomatic fracture lines. Monarchs must show their loyalty to one of these popes, which partly shapes alliances. France mainly supports the Avignon papacy, while some supporters of the Roman Pope are found on the English side and among the German princes. Although the religious dimension is crucial for the legitimization of royal power, the issue of the schism remains secondary to military urgencies. However, the existence of competing popes sometimes complicates the ratification of treaties or the obtaining of matrimonial dispensations to seal alliances. The rivalries between the Avignon and Roman clergies also result in complications for bishops and abbeys, with incomes in different kingdoms, reinforcing the idea of a fragmented Europe, divided between spiritual issues and political calculations. After the death of Charles V in 1380, the regency is organized around his brothers while awaiting the majority of Charles VI. Du Guesclin disappears the same year, swept away on the battlefield. The French reconquest then slightly slows down, and the rivalry among princes of the blood intensifies. Charles VI, then, during the early years of his reign, seeks to maintain the momentum of his father's policies, but his declining mental health, symbolized by his episodes of madness, starting in 1392, leads to the emergence of 2 rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This internal division weakens France and gives the English a chance to regain the initiative. At the beginning of the 15th century, the son of Richard II, Henry V of the House of Lancaster, ascends the English throne in 1413 with the ambition to reaffirm British supremacy on the continent. He takes advantage of the French civil wars to launch a major military expedition, aiming to reconquer Normandy and assert his legitimacy on the throne of France. The context is therefore particularly favorable to a new English offensive, especially since the French princes are too busy vying for the king's favor and access to power. Henry I's campaign materializes with the famous Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415. This date marks a major military setback for the French chivalry. Despite a clear numerical superiority, the French forces, composed largely of heavily armed cavalrymen, find themselves struggling against the English tactic. The longbowmen, positioned on the flanks, harass the French cavalry before they can reach them, while the mud and narrowness of the battlefield hinder the horses' progression. The French suffer considerable losses, particularly among the high nobility. King Charles VI, weakened and unable to actively direct operations, leaves the field open for Henry V to exploit his victory. Agincourt symbolizes not only the failure of the French chivalry to innovate tactically, but also strengthens England's prestige in the eyes of Europe. Aware of his advantage, Henry V wastes no time in pursuing his offensive. He occupies several strategic towns in Normandy, including Harfleur, before marching further into the kingdom. The French garrisons, poorly coordinated, struggle to contain the English advance, while the central power remains paralyzed by internal conflicts between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. In 1419, the situation worsens for France when John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, is assassinated on the bridge of Montereau in the presence of the Dauphin Charles. This event breaks any possibility of reconciliation between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs and pushes the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, to forge an alliance with England. In this context, Henry V takes advantage of his growing legitimacy to impose the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This text, signed in the name of the weakened King Charles VI, stipulates that the French monarch disinherits his son Charles and recognizes Henry V as the legitimate heir to the Kingdom of France. To seal this agreement, Henry V marries Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the King of France, thereby asserting his grip on the crown. Between 1420 and 1453, the conflict between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England seems frozen by the Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420. This treaty, concluded while the King of France, Charles VI, is weakened, recognizes Henry V of England as the legitimate heir to the French crown, thereby excluding the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII. In this context of a Franco-French civil war, with the Armagnacs supporting Charles and the Burgundians allied with England, the authority of the legitimate king is contested. In the midst of these rivalries and English domination over a large part of the territory, Joan of Arc makes her appearance in 1429 to defend the Dauphin's cause and restore hope to the faction loyal to the Valois. The Siege of Orléans, begun in October 1428, is a crucial episode. Orléans, a city located on the Loire and a strategic gateway to the south, is surrounded by the English troops of the Duke of Bedford. The defenders, already worn out by several months of fighting, fear that the fall of this city would open the way to total conquest for the English. It is then that Joan, a young peasant girl from Domremy in the east of the kingdom, claims to have been given a divine mission to free France. An improbable figurehead for a weary army, she is nonetheless presented to the Dauphin Charles, who hesitates before letting her go into battle. She is eventually granted a small contingent, aware that even a symbolic success could galvanize the troops. Joan arrives in Orléans at the end of April 1429, and, against all odds, manages to change the course of the siege. Joan's tactics and the boldness of the French assaults surprised the English. The Bastilles, these redoubts surrounding Orléans, fall one after another, liberating the city on May 8, 1429. This significant event, celebrated annually in Orléans, symbolizes the first great triumph of a revitalized French army. It is also a dramatic moment in terms of propaganda. The figure of Joan of Arc embodies an alliance between popular piety and a royalty in search of legitimacy. Accompanied by experienced captains like Lahier and Jean de Dunois, she pushes the royal army into a counter-offensive on the Loire, winning victories at Jargeau and Patay during the summer of 1429. These successes show the English that their supremacy, established since the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and bolstered by Burgundian alliances, is not unshakable. The path to Charles VII's coronation in Reims is thus opened. In the French monarchical tradition, the coronation in Reims, where the king is anointed with the oil of the Holy Ampoule, holds a sacred significance. Urged by Jean, the Dauphin's army advances toward the sacred city, crossing through territories controlled or disputed with little resistance, and reaches Reims in July 1429. The coronation takes place on July 17th. Charles VII is finally officially anointed as the King of France, amidst the cheers of a population who sees in this ceremony a return to legitimate dynastic order. Joan of Arc attends the event, standing close to the king, illustrating her proximity to power. This coronation, a powerful symbol, further weakens the English and Burgundian claims. Although it does not immediately end the fighting, this decisive step gives new political momentum to the French camp. In the years that follow, Joan becomes involved in military and diplomatic operations aimed at retaking Paris, still under Anglo-Burgundian control. The offensives launched in the fall of 1429 do not succeed in retaking the capital, and the young heroine ends up being captured in 1430 at Compiègne while trying to liberate the town. Handed over to the Burgundians, then sold to the English, she is tried for heresy in Rouen in 1431. This trial, conducted under the supervision of Bishop Cochon, seeks to undermine her spiritual and political legitimacy. Condemned, she is burned at the stake in the Old Marketplace on May 30th, 1431. Despite her martyrdom, the fervor she inspired persists. Many witnesses, including notables from Rouen, report the lasting effect of her sacrifice on the morale of both camps. For the French loyal to the King of Bourges, she becomes a symbol of emerging patriotism. For the English, her death does not end the resistance. On the ground, Charles VII's reforms then begin the modernization of the French army. Artillery, slow to develop during the early phases of the conflict, now takes a central role. Foundry masters, often originating from German or Italian regions, perfect the manufacture of bronze cannons. These pieces, lighter than the primitive wrought iron bombards, offer greater accuracy. They are mounted on carriages, allowing for easier movement, although this remains complex and costly. This newfound superiority, combined with the creation of the compagnies d'ordonnance, boosts the effectiveness of the royal host. The compagnies d'ordonnance, established from 1445 onwards, lay the foundations for a permanent army. Soldiers are maintained by a regular salary, better disciplined, and equipped with a structured command, unlike the occasional bands of mercenaries. This evolution helps to assert the authority of the king, who can now rely on a more stable operational force. Simultaneously, Charles VII strengthens the kingdom's institutions. The Parliament of Paris, which had seen its role undermined by internal conflicts and occupation, gradually regains an asserted position in the judicial hierarchy. This court of justice, whose mission is to register royal ordinances and adjudicate major disputes, becomes a pillar of monarchical restoration. Its influence extends during the reconquest of entire provinces, and its legal presence consolidates the throne's legitimacy. The financial administration, severely tested by the war's duration, also modernizes. Taxes, once levied irregularly, are gradually rationalized through a network of bailiffs and seneschals more loyal to the sovereign. The revenues thus collected support the military effort, notably the purchase and maintenance of artillery. After the disappearance of Joan of Arc, the conflict is far from over, but France regains ground. The rivalries between the Dukes of Bedford and Gloucester weaken the English camp, while the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, politically advantaged by the Treaty of Arras, concluded in 1435, draws closer to the King of France. This agreement ends the civil war within France itself and gradually isolates the English forces, whose presence remains strong in the north and in Guyenne, around Bordeaux. The gradual re-establishment of a strong royal power, aided by military innovations, then paves the way for a series of reconquests. The Duchy of Normandy, controlled by the English since the beginning of the 15th century, was retaken during decisive campaigns conducted in the 1440s and 1450s. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 demonstrated the efficiency of French artillery against English infantry and archers. This decisive success initiated the progressive collapse of English positions in the north. Simultaneously, Charles VII sent experienced captains to reconquer Guyenne, a region primarily focused on viticulture and of major economic importance, particularly due to wine trade with England. The inhabitants of Bordeaux, long loyal to the Plantagenets for commercial reasons, gradually noticed the shifting advantages to the French side. In 1453, the Battle of Castillon, near Bordeaux, sealed the lasting reconquest of Guyenne. This confrontation illustrates how combat methods had changed. Leaning on numerous and well-placed artillery, the King's Lieutenant General, Jean Bureau, erected several light fortifications, defending cannons arranged in a formidable battery. The English, commanded by John Talbot, launched a poorly coordinated attack and underestimated the French firepower. When Talbot's troops charged, they suffered a deadly barrage. The English leader, a legendary figure among his soldiers, perished during the battle, which ended in a crushing defeat. Castillon thus marked the end of English military presence in Guyenne and, more broadly, on almost all French soil except for Calais, which remained under English control long after the war. The consequences of this victory reverberated in the organization of the kingdom. The gendarmes of ordonnance, from the companies of ordonnance created a few years earlier, now embodied a regular force serving the king, capable of maintaining order in the reconquered provinces. This new military structure, composed of heavily armed cavalrymen and supported by salaried infantry, transformed internal power dynamics. The nobles, rather than raising their brilliant but ephemeral feudal contingents, gradually integrated into a more centralized system. The king thus established himself as the supreme arbiter of internal peace, while the nobility, in exchange for a salary and honors, placed their warriors at the crown's service. The Parliament of Paris further solidified during these years. With the end of major troubles, its authority was again exercised over the entire royal domain, validating edicts and ordinances that set the kingdom's administration. Royal officers established texts unifying certain legal practices, even though regional customs remained vibrant. The monarch's control over military and political domains was strengthened, leaving progressively less room for quasi-independent great principalities. These developments helped shape the modern state, where the king's advisors studied taxation methods, judicial reorganization projects, and mechanisms of territorial control. The gradual end of the war then favored a cultural and religious revival. French cities, rebuilding their resources, began the repair of damaged churches and cathedrals. Monastic communities, supported by the lay elite, also revived scriptoria where liturgical manuscripts and chronicles recalling the kingdom's setbacks and triumphs were copied. In this renewal, the image of Joan of Arc took on a quasi-mystical dimension as the bourgeois, the clergy, and the petty nobility, still marked by the siege of Orléans, or by tales of her bravery, maintained her memory. The figure of the maid inspired late chansons de geste, which praised not only her military virtues, but also her devotion to the divine and royal cause. These chansons de geste and epic religious poems, composed in the vernacular language, circulated between princely courts, monasteries, and merchant cities. They recounted the great deeds of the young shepherdess, her conduct on the battlefield, and her exhortations to piety. Minstrels, performing in cities or around lordly palaces, quoted excerpts from these stories, contributing to the emergence of a collective sense of belonging to the notion of the Kingdom of France. Gradually, Joan of Arc became the embodiment of nascent patriotism and an example of feminine heroism in a largely male-dominated society. The reach of her story crossed borders, notably through Italian or Flemish merchants, who brought snippets of her tale abroad. The Johannic myth, fueled by the stories of her comrades in arms and by the writings of certain clerics, goes beyond strictly military considerations. Contemporaries see in it a divine intervention in favor of a weakened monarch and, more broadly, in favor of the people of France. The testimonies collected during the rehabilitation procedures conducted after the war reveal the popular attachment to this savior figure. Over the years, even some English chroniclers admit the exceptional nature of this young woman, while still maintaining their reservations regarding the legitimacy of Charles VII. Ultimately, Joan of Arc symbolizes this historical turning point where princes must reckon with the courage and faith of modest people, capable of overturning the outcome of a conflict thought to be static. After Castillon, Guyenne becomes fully French again. Bordeaux, although initially reluctant, submits in October 1453. The terms of surrender are hardly favorable to the English, deprived of one of their most precious possessions on the continent. Trade, temporarily interrupted, resumes under the watchful eye of the royal power, keen not to alienate a prosperous region. The Aquitanian nobility, once close to the English crown, must now adapt to this new political order and pledge allegiance to the sovereign seated in Chinon, and increasingly frequently in Tours or Paris. The death of Talbot on the battlefield has a traumatic effect in the English camp. Considered one of the last great captains capable of restoring his monarchy's authority in France, he leaves a void that neither the regent nor the nobles managed to fill. England retreats to its islands, plagued by its own internal divisions that will soon lead to the Wars of the Roses, York against Lancaster. This political fragility, coupled with the successes of French artillery and the shrewd diplomatic maneuvers of Charles VII, allows the Valois to gradually recover their sovereignty. Only the city of Calais remains an enclave under English authority, a symbol of the past, but also a hardened motif of future discord. The royal state, on the other hand, strengthens itself by consolidating reforms already initiated. A permanent army, structured by companies of ordonnance, provides the king with a deterrent force. The gendarmes of ordonnance, archetypes of elite cavalry, are supported by pikemen and paid archers, ensuring better training. The artillery, for its part, becomes the key instrument of sieges and battles, especially after the successful experience of Formigny and Castillon. This technological superiority, reinforced by the accumulation of bronze cannons and the training of competent gunners, transforms the way war is conducted. Henceforth, forts and city walls alone cannot provide insurmountable defense against mobile and effective cannons. This renewed arsenal coincides with an evolution in political mentalities. The devastation caused by decades of conflict stirs an aspiration for peace and order, which the king strives to embody. The Parliament of Paris, whose chambers experience a resurgence of activity, plays an increasing role in resolving disputes. Royal officers, more numerous, traverse the provinces to collect taxes, judge cases on appeal, and ensure the obedience of local lords. The legal framework, once fragmented, becomes structured as Charles VII multiplies ordinances to unify certain practices, though the legislative unification of the kingdom will remain a long-term project. Within the population, a slow identity phenomenon is underway. The long foreign occupation, coupled with sometimes complex allegiances, has nonetheless given rise to a growing sense of belonging to a common territory. Literary works, whether new epic songs, eyewitness accounts, or religious tracts, nurture this awareness. Joan of Arc becomes its most brilliant icon, and her impact continues in an unexpected way. The memory of the Maid is expressed in urban rituals, during processions and votive feasts, commemorating the liberation of Orléans or other cities. Fabliaux and historical prose also evoke popular devotions in her honor, reaffirming the link between faith and a sense of national unity. The upper layers of French society, initially distrustful of a prophetic peasant girl, eventually exploit this myth. The nobility use it to enhance their own loyalty to the throne, while the clergy find in it an example of obedience to the church, despite the initial exploitation of the trial by the English party. Merchants see in the momentum generated by the heroine the opportunity to promote the idea of a united kingdom, a unified market where they can trade under the protection of a stronger and more stable state. Each social category projects onto Joan of Arc aspirations that converge towards the defense of the kingdom and the figure of a consolidated monarch. In 1494, the King of France, Charles V, heir to the Valois dynasty, embarks on an expedition to Italy with the ambition to assert his rights to the Kingdom of Naples, then controlled by the Aragonese dynasty. This venture is rooted in claims inherited from the Angevins, former lords of Naples, and the desire to assert royal power on the European stage. This French interference in the Italian peninsula triggers a chain reaction among several Italian states, including Milan and Venice, which sometimes seek to ally with Charles VIII or to defend themselves in order to preserve their territories and resources. Rapid changes of alliances occur, reflecting the precarious balance between the competing ambitions of the great European powers. From the outset, the French presence in Italy also worries the Spanish sovereigns, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, who see in this intervention a direct threat to their peninsular possessions. In order to secure his passage, Charles VIII concludes temporary agreements with Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, who hopes to use French support to strengthen his local authority. However, this agreement proves to be fragile. Charles VIII's initial successes in Naples aroused the hostility of the League of Venice, formed in 1495, and including Venice, Pope Alexander VI, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and the Kingdom of Aragon. This coalition forces Charles V to withdraw, despite achieving a notable victory at Fornovo in July 1495. The French expedition, despite its brevity, paves the way for a period of almost uninterrupted wars in Italy, where different European sovereigns vie for control of wealthy cities and strategic territories. After Charles VIII, his cousin and successor Louis X, from the same lineage, continues the campaign in Italy by claiming the Duchy of Milan through his descent from Valentina Visconti. He undertakes significant military efforts to consolidate the French presence in the north of the peninsula, which again stirs coalitions of Italian and foreign princes. Under his reign, France manages for a time to occupy Milan and maintain relative control through local governors. However, upon Louis XIII's death in 1515, it is Francis I who inherits the throne and takes command of the Italian campaigns. Barely crowned, he launches an offensive to reconquer the Milanese region, winning the famous Battle of Marignano near Milan in September 1515. This victory, achieved notably through the strength of the French cavalry and support from Swiss mercenaries, establishes Francis III's reputation as a modern and ambitious sovereign. The initial phase of the Italian War under Francis III is characterized by a series of diplomatic agreements with several Italian cities and major players such as Pope Leo X. Nevertheless, the competition broadens when Emperor Charles V, from the House of Habsburg and King of Spain since 1516, inherits the Austrian and Burgundian possessions. Now, the struggle for control of Italy transforms into a vast European conflict since Charles V, by his imperial coronation in 1519, emerges as the primary rival of the King of France on the continent. The confrontations shift between Italian territory and the respective possessions of the two sovereigns, resulting in fluctuating alliances and constant mobilization of resources. In this context, England, under the Tudor dynasty, finds itself in the position of an arbiter and a coveted partner. King Henry VIII, reigning since 1509, skillfully exploits the Franco-imperial rivalry to alternately support France or the empire. Despite a cultural and diplomatic proximity with France, illustrated in 1513 by the Battle of Terouanne, where English and imperial troops allied against the French, followed by very formal meetings, Henry VIII ensures to maintain a balance, allowing him to benefit from concessions from either camp. The most spectacular example remains the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a lavish gathering in June 1520 near Calais, then an English possession between Francis I and Henry VIII. In a setting of extravagance and festivities, the two monarchs seek to impress each other with their riches, attire, and spectacles. The goal remains to seal a personal alliance. However, England keeps the option to negotiate with Charles V to serve its interests in the European theater. This pompous diplomacy does not halt warfare. Rather, it fuels a fierce competition for influence over the Pope, for the domination of Italy, and for the control of maritime routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Atlantic.
Make it right in the next life.
While Francis I and Charles III clash militarily in Italy, England embarks on a religious revolution with major political consequences. Starting in 1527, Henry VIII, wishing to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, encounters the refusal of Pope Clement VII. This failure paves the way for the Anglican Schism. In 1533, the Act of Supremacy officially breaks with Rome, and Henry VIII establishes himself as the supreme head of the Church of England, denouncing papal authority. This nascent Protestant reform incites contradictory reactions at the French court, where humanist circles are sensitive to the new ideas, yet the royal power, attached to Catholicism, distrusts religious agitation. The affair of the placards, occurring in 1534, illustrates this tension. Notices criticizing the Catholic Mass were posted as far as on the royal chamber door in Amboise. Shocked and fearing the spread of Lutheran theses, Francis I harshly represses Protestant circles. However, France refrains from completely breaking with foreign reform supporters as the king seeks support to contain the power of Charles V. In the game of shifting alliances, Francis I turns to an unexpected partner, the Ottoman Empire. Led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire controls vast territories in the Near East, North Africa, and the Balkans, and poses a constant threat to the Holy Roman Empire. In 1536, a Franco-Ottoman alliance treaty is concluded, marking a radical diplomatic turn in European history. For the first time, a Christian power openly collaborates with a Muslim empire to weaken a Catholic sovereign, in this case, Charles V. This alliance materializes both through Turkish naval support in the Mediterranean, notably during maritime raids against Spanish possessions, and through land pressures on the empire's eastern borders. Both allies find their account. Francis I benefits from the support of an immense fleet, while Suleiman profits from the strengthening of a western front, diverting Charles VI's attention. The King of England observes this Franco-Ottoman alliance with caution, viewing it as contrary to the Christian balance. Having now broken with Rome, Henry V is aware that he is a potential target of a Catholic crusade, but does not want to encourage Ottoman advancement in the Mediterranean either. Intermittently, England continues to hold secret discussions with Charles V to ensure that it is not isolated in the event of a major conflict. However, London's priority remains the consolidation of the Anglican Church and the neutralization of any internal opposition, while the diplomacy of balance continues on the continental level. Religious disagreements harden. England gradually shifts towards Protestantism, while France stiffens around state Catholicism, despite the existence of growing Reformed minorities. These new divisions complicate the map of alliances, with each monarch seeking to reconcile their territorial and financial interests with their religious convictions, or at least to use them to justify their strategic choices.
The encore's what we're praying for.
Beyond the great battles and diplomatic games, one of the most surprising episodes of this Franco-Ottoman rapprochement takes place in 1543 in Toulon, a port in the southeast of France. As part of their collaboration against the emperor, the French and Ottoman fleets organized combined operations, particularly in the western Mediterranean. To shelter the Ottoman galleys during the winter, Francis I authorizes the stationing of the Turkish squadron in the roadstead of Toulon. Thousands of Ottoman sailors temporarily settle in the city, building infrastructures to house the crews and ensuring the maintenance of the ships. On the warships, both the Muslim crescent flag and the Cross of France are displayed simultaneously, an ostentatious sign of a military alliance that disrupts the religious sensibilities of the time. Chroniclers recount that church bells, temporarily silent, coexist with the imam's call to prayer, while Provençal merchants trade with these unusual allies. Contemporary accounts highlight the astonishment, even scandal, aroused by this coexistence. The sight of two flags, previously considered irreconcilable, flying side by side, particularly shocks English and imperial observers. In English opinion, this is often portrayed as proof of a political and religious heresy by the French, a betrayal of the traditional role of the elder daughter of the Church that France had long claimed. The consequences of this alliance are felt during the military campaigns of the same decade. The Ottoman squadrons harass the Spanish coasts and help France contain the navy of Charles V. As a result, the Tudors fear that England might be the next target of Ottoman incursions in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic, even though, in practice, Ottoman priorities remain focused on the Balkans and the Italian coasts. The reaction in England is fueled by pamphlets that wave the specter of an Islamic threat, supported by a Christian king. Henry VIII, already in the midst of an internal religious reorganization, thus works to strengthen his coastal fortifications, anticipating a possible attack. On the diplomatic front, he simultaneously strives to maintain dialogue with Francis I to avoid total isolation in the face of the Franco-Ottoman coalition. However, the death of Henry VIII in 1547 creates a period of political instability at the English court, which Edward VI and then Mary Tudor successively inherit. Religious fluctuations then continue with the pace of royal successions. Edward VI is Protestant, Mary Tudor is Catholic. This evolution complicates negotiations with France and the various protagonists of the Italian theater. The Italian wars themselves continue under the reign of King Henry II of France, son of Francis I, who ascends the throne in 1547. Maintaining the Ottoman alliance, he also approaches certain German Protestant princes against Emperor Charles V, seeking to force the Imperial League to scatter over multiple fronts. Military operations take place both in northern Italy, where France strives to maintain influence, and in the territories bordering the Rhine. Over the course of the campaigns, Italy suffers numerous destructions. Cities are sacked, populations displaced, epidemics and economic collapse hit certain regions, exhausted by ongoing war amongst multiple armies. Spain, on its part, reinforces its positions in the southern Italian peninsula, while England participates in occasional interventions, notably to prevent any French expansion in Flanders or on the Atlantic coasts. The conflict becomes further complicated with the emergence of improved firearms, the use of mobile artillery, and the gradual adaptation of urban fortifications to siege cannons, which doubles the cost of military rivalries and deepens the debts of the engaged powers. Francois I died in 1547, leaving Henry II to pursue the war. He stood out for a policy of prestige, seeking to restore French influence driven by a chivalric ideal mixed with tactical innovations. On the other hand, Charles V, at the head of an empire stretching from Germany to the Americas, struggled to simultaneously manage the Ottoman pressure, the rebellion of Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire, and French ambitions in Italy. In the 1550s, Europe was therefore torn apart by these multiple conflicts, so much so that it is sometimes referred to as the First European World War, due to the geographical extent of the battles and the complexity of the alliances. The maritime powers exploited their fleets in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and even the North Sea. Civilian populations paid a heavy price, while some Italian cities changed hands several times over a few years. The death of Francois did not interrupt the diplomatic relationship between France and the Sublime Porte. Henry II understood that Ottoman naval support could remain decisive in preventing Charles V from consolidating his ambitions in the Mediterranean. Several historians note that trade was not neglected either. French merchants obtained favorable commercial concessions in the Levant, while the Ottomans appreciated the quality of French craftsmen and the prospect of cultural exchanges. The presence of French ambassadors in Istanbul became more regular, and efforts continued to maintain the Franco-Ottoman fleet in the western basin of the Mediterranean. On the English side, the prospect of an established Hispano-imperial control over Italy and the maritime route to eastern riches sometimes prompted reconsideration of alliances, with the idea that a continent subjected to a single emperor would not serve their insular interests. However, the religious divide widened rapidly. England in the 1550s under Mary Tudor returned to Catholicism and moved closer to a certain form of understanding with the empire, especially since Mary married Philip II of Spain, the son of Charles V. This union temporarily solidified the ties between England and the imperial power, simultaneously heightening France's distrust. Henry II indeed feared a unified front between Spain and England, which would thwart French military maneuvers in northern Italy. Facing this risk, Henry VI maintained pressure on Piedmont and Milan, while supporting the German Protestants to divide the imperial forces. On the maritime front, collaboration with the Ottoman Navy proved crucial in standing up to the Spanish galleys, although good relations did not always translate into decisive triumphs. Joint expeditions highlighted cultural differences, but also demonstrated the formidable political adaptability of sovereigns, willing to ally with the infidel to counter Christian rivals. The loss of Calais in 1558 marked a major turning point in the rivalry between France and England. This strategic port, located on the northern coast of France, had been the last territorial foothold of the English crown on the European continent for 2 centuries. Inherited from the 100 Years' War, it had been retained through various diplomatic crises and intermittent conflicts. However, the military pressure exerted by the French armies under the reign of Henry II, son of François III, ultimately forced the English to abandon what they considered a valuable stronghold. The geopolitical repercussions were profound. The city of Calais had provided English sovereigns with direct access to the continent, facilitating privileged commercial exchanges with the neighboring Flanders and ensuring a potential terrestrial link for any military operation. Its loss, beyond the moral shock among the English, caused a redeployment of their maritime ambitions. They began to focus more on naval routes, particularly those connecting the Atlantic to the Spanish possessions of the New World, while the French crown solidified its control over its entire northern coastline. Thus began the gradual transition to a more pronounced form of maritime competition. Shortly after, the advent of Elizabeth I in 1558 as the head of England led to a cultural and political turning point. The Queen, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, implemented a strategy focused on internal consolidation and naval expansion. The Elizabethan era became synonymous with an emphasis on building fleets capable of competing with continental powers, notably Habsburg Spain, which was then engaged in intensive exploitation of its American colonies. English leaders supported privateering expeditions, including the popular Francis Drake, to undermine Spanish maritime hegemony and acquire loot and information. Francis Drake, born around 1540 in Devon, distinguished himself through numerous daring raids against the Spanish colonial empire. He attacked Havana in Cuba and Cadiz in Andalusia, creating confusion among the galleons laden with tons of gold and silver from the Americas. Covertly supported by Queen Elizabeth, he became a national hero in England, while cultivating a reputation as an especially exasperating pirate for the Spanish monarchy. This unofficial policy of naval hostility was also accompanied by occasional support to the French Protestants, then engaged in the wars of religion to counter the plans of the Catholic League. The Spanish reaction was not long in coming. Under the reign of Philip II, the Catholic monarchy dreamed of eliminating all Protestant resistance in Europe and breaking England's growing influence over the seas. In 1588, the famous Invincible Armada, composed of about 100 ships, sailed from Lisbon with the aim of invading England. The French, still divided by the religious conflicts, were indirectly involved in the undertaking, with some aristocrats of the Catholic League looking favorably on the potential triumph of Philip II. Yet the Spanish fleet was struck by contrary winds and ingenious English tactics. The lighter and more maneuverable English ships of the line harassed the Armada along the southern coast of England, preventing it from approaching the beaches to land its troops. Ultimately, the storm scattered the Spanish forces, forcing the surviving ships on a journey around Scotland and Ireland in an attempt to return home. This defeat, resounding for Spain, consolidated England's maritime reputation and reinforced Elizabeth's determination to support naval and commercial projects. On the French side, the Catholic League, which hoped for a rebalancing in its favor, had to revise its international ambitions. In the 17th century, European dynamics were profoundly marked by the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, a conflict initially centered on the Holy Roman Empire. France, under Cardinal Richelieu, although Catholic, chose to support the German Protestant princes to weaken the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria. England, under the reign of Charles III in the 1630s, initially opted for relative neutrality, torn between a king inclined to sympathize with certain continental powers and a mistrustful parliament. This period was also marked by rising internal tensions in England, a prelude to the Civil War. The English Civil War broke out in 1642, pitting royalists against parliamentarians. As Charles III's forces clashed with those led by Oliver Cromwell, France continued its involvement in the 30 Years' War against Spain. Following the execution of Charles III in 1649, England was transformed into a republican commonwealth led by Cromwell. This new regime, despite its ideological distance from the French monarchy, eventually allied with Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor, in a coalition against Spain. The motivations were both religious and strategic. France sought to contain the Habsburgs, and England wanted to assert its naval power. This unexpected Franco-English collaboration, unforeseen just a few decades earlier, dealt severe blows to the Spanish Empire. Between 1652 and 1659, France and England coordinated certain naval operations to impede the convoys of precious metals transiting to Iberian ports. Meanwhile, negotiations continued in parallel to set future territorial balances in Europe. This period was marked by shifting and sometimes fragile alliances, but it demonstrated the capability of the two nations to find common interest against a power they then perceived as the primary enemy. Attention also turned to global maritime trade. However, if France and England were to agree against Spain, London also harbored intense competition with the Dutch Republic. As early as 1651, the English Parliament adopted the Navigation Acts aiming to reserve the maritime transport of goods imported or exported from England to ships flying the English flag. These laws, intended to weaken Dutch commercial superiority, triggered the First Anglo-Dutch War of 1652-1654. France, then led by Mazarin, maintained a status of attentive observer, fearing both Dutch expansion and the consolidation of English naval power. The English Channel and the North Sea became theaters of frequent skirmishes. The Anglo-Dutch rivalry reflected the growing importance of transoceanic trade, then booming. The Dutch Republic possessed a considerable merchant fleet and controlled strategic trading posts all over the world, from Southeast Asia to Africa. England aspired to assert its own overseas presence, encouraged by the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell, eager to establish itself as a new maritime power. While naval battles multiplied between the English and the Dutch, France watched how these conflicts could reshuffle the cards of international trade and create new cracks, exploitable diplomatically. The peace signed between England and the Dutch Republic in 1654 did not definitively end this commercial animosity, but allowed for a few years of relative calm. In France, Mazarin sought to preserve his forces to conclude the conflict against Spain victoriously, eventually resulting in the Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659. During this period, England consolidated its republican regime, developing a better organized fleet and laying the groundwork for a colonial administration. Religious antagonisms partially eased in favor of a pragmatic strategy aimed at long-distance economic and naval expansion. The restoration of the monarchy in England, with Charles II as of 1660, did not fundamentally change the country's maritime orientation. On the contrary, the Crown further asserted its claims over the oceans, while adopting new measures to encourage colonization in North America and the Caribbean. While the French monarchy under Louis XIV also bolstered its navy, England once again went to war with the Dutch Republic in the 1660s and 1670s. Meanwhile, France continued to gradually extend its influence along the Atlantic coast and the Mediterranean. By the end of the 17th century, England experienced internal upheavals leading to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which ousted James II in favor of William of Orange. For France, this dynastic change in London meant the alliance of England with the Dutch Republic against Louis XIV, marking the beginning of a new geopolitical configuration. Nevertheless, between 1658 and 1688, maritime and colonial rivalries had already reshaped balances, leaving their mark on both sides of the Channel and shaping the foundations of future European colonial empires. By the end of the 17th century, Europe was shaken by a series of events that disrupted the balance partly established by previous treaties. At the heart of this turmoil, Louis XIV's France found itself confronted with England, now governed by William of Orange, who became William III after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. At this time, King James II, Catholic and allied with Louis XIV, was overthrown by a political and military uprising combining Orange forces and the support of many English parliamentarians. William of Orange, from the powerful House of Orange-Nassau, dominating the Dutch Republic, today's Netherlands, then accepted the joint crown of England, Scotland, and Ireland, alongside his wife Mary, daughter of James II. This seemingly peaceful revolution, which did not result in radical regime changes in the short term, nevertheless caused a profound upheaval in European geopolitics. Louis XIV found himself deprived of a partner on the English throne and faced with a new sovereign, fiercely opposed to French hegemony on the continent. In this context, the rivalry between France and this reformed England, now deeply Protestant and parliamentary, takes on a new dimension. While Louis XIV seeks to strengthen his eastern borders and maintain his influence in Europe, William III works to build vast alliances to contain French power. The first major conflict arising from this reshuffling of the deck is the War of the League of Augsburg, sometimes called the 9 Years' War, 1688-1697. This coalition brings together, around the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, several German princes, England, the United Provinces, and other European powers eager to counter France's repeated territorial expansions. The immediate causes of the conflict include border claims in the Rhineland and the will of Protestant powers to curb the aggressive policy of the Sun King, perceived as a champion of Catholicism and an expansionist sovereign. During the war, military operations follow one another on different theaters of operation, in Flanders, in Catalonia, in northern Italy, but also at sea. The Navy plays a crucial role, as it is not only about protecting trade routes, but also deterring enemy troop landings. It is at this time that Anne Hilarion de Costentin, Count of Tourville, one of the greatest officers of the French Navy, distinguishes himself. He is tasked with protecting the kingdom's coasts and confronting the formidable Anglo-Dutch fleet, which combines Dutch naval combat expertise with English financial resources. In 1692, off Barfleur and then La Hougue, Tourville has to confront enemy squadrons superior in number. Although he shows exemplary courage, his squadron suffers heavy losses, including a large number of ships burned on the coasts by the Anglo-Dutch. This episode, often called the Disaster of La Hougue, subsequently limits France's ability to directly threaten England by sea. At the same time, this period sees the development of new forms of war financing that durably transform European economies. In 1694, England founds the Bank of England. The goal is to centralize credit, create long-term government loans, and facilitate fundraising to support the war effort. Private investors subscribe to these loans in exchange for solid guarantees, backed by a more powerful parliament than in France. On the French side, the monarchy relies more on a system of rente, that is, titles ensuring a fixed annual income to the state's creditors. However, the mechanism remains more traditional and less flexible, as Louis XIII tends to resort to direct taxation. The limits of this setup are felt over the conflicts, as the Kingdom of France finds itself heavily indebted and dependent on new tax levies that weigh on a population already strained by successive wars. The War of the League of Augsburg ends with the Treaty of Ryswick, 1697. In this agreement, France, exhausted by the fighting, retains some of its territorial gains, but must recognize William III as the legitimate King of England, thus officially renouncing support for James II and his exiled supporters. Nevertheless, tension remains high as another international crisis looms with the question of succession to the Spanish throne. King Charles II of Spain, the last representative of the Spanish Habsburg branch, is ill and heirless. His death, which occurred in 1700, opens a major conflict over the sharing of this vast empire. For Louis XIV, it is an opportunity to consolidate the French position by placing his grandson, Philip of Anjou, on the Spanish throne. But this decision is unacceptable to other European powers, who fear a shift in the balance in favor of France and the potential union of the French and Spanish crowns. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1713, breaks out to decide the fate of this vast inheritance. On one side, France supports the new king, Philip V of Spain, grandson of Louis XIV, and hopes to cement a lasting alliance with the Iberian Peninsula. On the other side, England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria form a new coalition supported by several German princes, and Brandenburg, Prussia, worried about France establishing continental hegemony. This conflict would last more than a decade, mobilizing enormous human and financial resources. The battlefields shift between Catalonia, the Netherlands, northern Italy, and Germany, while the naval war pits a weakened French fleet against the combined squadrons of England and Holland. In this long conflict, significant battles occur. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704 represents an important turning point. Located near the Danube in Bavaria, it sees the Franco-Bavarian army face the coalition commanded by the Duke of Marlborough for England and Prince Eugene of Savoy for Austria. Marlborough, a talented military leader, successfully coordinates the Allied infantry and cavalry, while the French suffer from disorganization and lack of sufficient reinforcements. The result is a heavy defeat for Louis XIV, who loses some of his aura of invincibility. This event prompts several German princes to join the coalition more actively, sensing France is vulnerable and in retreat. 2 years later, in 1706, the Battle of Ramillies, near Namur in the Spanish Netherlands, present-day Belgium, confirms the tactical superiority of Marlborough over the French and Bavarian troops. Again, the English cavalry and its allies crush the French lines, forcing the Sun King's regiments to retreat and abandon a significant portion of the southern Netherlands. This loss of territory threatens to open an Allied corridor at France's doorsteps, weakening the position of Louis XIV's armies on the northern front. In 1709, the Battle of Malplaquet, also in present-day Belgian territory, further accentuates this military rivalry. Though victory goes nominally to the coalition, led by Marlborough and Eugene of Savoy, they suffer such high losses that they cannot fully exploit their success. On the French side, Marshal Villars, despite a serious injury, stands firm and inflicts a bloody toll on the opposing troops. Malplaquet counts among the most murderous battles of the conflict. It also illustrates the determination of both camps to prevail, despite the progressive exhaustion of their resources. Do the Allied victories definitively undermine French power? Not quite, as the country still possesses a strong defensive resistance and manages to slow the enemy's advance. However, France sees its finances drained and its population exhausted by taxes, requisitions, and famine in several provinces. At sea, Tourville's navy was replaced following the disaster of 1692 and multiple French losses. The warships built in the shipyards of Brest and Toulon, though of good quality, are no longer enough to rival the English fleet, modernized by the Royal Navy. England uses its mastery of the seas to control trade exchanges and intercept valuable Spanish cargoes bound for France. This English maritime superiority, reinforced by the Dutch alliance, gradually cuts off French supply routes, forcing Louis XIV to focus efforts on the land theater and limit major naval operations. On the diplomatic chessboard, England, now rejuvenated by the Glorious Revolution and endowed with innovative financial institutions, is on its way to becoming the leading commercial and maritime power in Europe. The granting of the Asiento Clause, the exclusive right to supply slaves to Spanish America, will be one of the major issues at the end of the conflict. This commercial advantage, fiercely negotiated with Spain, places London at the forefront of the transatlantic slave trade, although other powers like Portugal and Holland also continue to participate. On European soil, the Allies demand significant territorial and political compensations to recognize Philip V, while preventing the union of the French and Spanish crowns. The longer the war drags on, the more secret negotiations and peace initiatives multiply. Louis XIV, faced with the revolt of some of his subjects suffering from famine and taxes, realizes that a military outcome looks bleak. On the English side, voices are also rising to end a costly conflict. Queen Anne, who succeeded William III after his death in 1702, is ready to negotiate, provided certain guarantees are assured and the French power agrees to significant concessions. Preliminary conferences are then organized, also involving the Emperor and the Dutch Republic, while the first partial peace treaties begin to take shape as early as 1711-1712, notably with the Utrecht conferences beginning. In these negotiations, the question of the Spanish succession remains central, but other considerations are added. The English demand to obtain Gibraltar, a strategic position at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea, initially meets with Spanish resistance, but the balance of power plays in London's favor. The cession of the island of Minorca, an important naval base in the Mediterranean, strengthens the English maritime setup. Furthermore, England demands control over certain French possessions in targeted territories to consolidate its North American colonies. France, aware of the weakening of its allies and the need to end this financial hemorrhage, eventually makes painful, but deemed necessary, concessions for the survival of the kingdom and the Catholic dynasty installed in Spain. The peace treaties, known under the generic name of the Treaties of Utrecht, are concluded in 1713. By these agreements, Philip V is recognized as King of Spain, but he must formally renounce any claim to the French throne, thus preventing a dynastic union feared by the maritime powers in Austria. England obtains vast territorial and commercial advantages. It acquires Gibraltar and Minorca, securing crucial control of the Western Mediterranean. It also receives guarantees for its trade in Spanish America, notably the Asiento, which opens the way to exclusive trade with the Spanish colonies. On the North Atlantic front, France agrees to cede some of its possessions to England's benefit. Acadia and part of Newfoundland fall under English sovereignty, which will have profound repercussions on the French populations settled there for decades. Acadia, whose French colonization dated back to the early 17th century, is now under English domination, paving the way for a slow eviction of Francophone settlers by the British Crown in the following decades. Newfoundland, strategic for fishing and navigation to Canada, strengthens the English grip on what will become a major fishing pole in the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic, which played a significant role in the conflict, also receives some compensations, although less spectacular than those of England. France, though politically defeated, nonetheless retains the majority of its metropolitan territory, thus protecting its defensive buffer along its natural borders. The conflict lingers a few more months with the emperor, until the Treaty of Rastatt in 1714 and Baden in 1714, but the main agreement remains that concluded at Utrecht. From then on, Europe is reshaped with a clearly established colonial and naval leader, England, while France, still powerful on land, must acknowledge the loss of a number of strategic points. The aging King Louis XIV preserves the crown for his great-grandson Louis XV, thus ensuring the continuity of the Bourbon dynasty. However, the signing of these treaties opens a new political and economic era where England, permanently transformed by the Glorious Revolution and the creation of the Bank of England, takes the lead of world trade and establishes itself as the arbiter of European balances. At the beginning of the 18th century, France and England each pursued an imperial ambition that projected them into a global competition for control over the planet's main strategic points. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, marked the end of the War of the Spanish Succession and redrew the colonial presence of European powers. England then obtained territorial concessions such as Newfoundland and Hudson Bay, while France, after supporting the Spanish claims, focused on its positions in North America and India. However, these new dividing lines did not prevent the two countries from quickly entering into direct confrontation for commercial and military hegemony overseas. Thus, a dual theater of operations emerged, one in India, the other on the North American continent, more precisely in Canada and the neighboring colonies. In India, the French East India Company, founded in 1664 under the impetus of Minister Colbert, sought to expand its network of trading posts established along the peninsula's coasts. Be it Pondicherry, Chandernagore, or Mahé, these posts ensured access to spices, cottons, silks, and a variety of exotic goods highly prized in Europe. Their rival, the British East India Company, established since 1600, enjoyed considerable advantages: more consistent political support from the crown, robust financial means, and local alliances forged over decades. From the 1740s, the growing tensions between these two companies crystallized around emblematic figures like Joseph-François Dupleix, Governor-General of the French establishments in India, and Robert Clive, an ambitious officer of the English company. Dupleix, a shrewd negotiator, tried to take advantage of the political fragmentation of the Indian subcontinent. He entered into agreements with local leaders, supported candidates favorable to French interests, and endeavored to hinder British expansion. In response, Clive applied similar methods, relying on internal rivalries among Nawabs, consolidating military presence and laying the groundwork for what would later become British hegemony in the Indian Raj. Meanwhile, on the North American continent, France firmly anchored itself along the St. Lawrence River and down to Louisiana, then encompassing a large part of the Mississippi Basin. French settlers, often fewer in number than their English counterparts, nevertheless maintained close relations with several Native American nations, providing a sometimes decisive strategic advantage during border conflicts. The British, for their part, concentrated on the Atlantic coast and rapidly spread inland. Over the decades, the increase in the English population, especially in the 13 colonies, accentuated pressure on French territorial margins. However, before the War of the Austrian Succession, the two powers avoided a total confrontation in America. They preferred to diplomatically exploit European quarrels to strike the adversary in its colonial positions or seize vital trading posts at each treaty's conclusion. The War of Austrian Succession in 1740-1748 disrupted this precarious balance. In Europe, France supported the claims of the Elector of Bavaria against Maria Theresa of Austria, while England, anxious to counter French influence, sided with the Habsburgs. In this context, the conflict quickly exported to the seas and within their respective possessions. In Canada, the stronghold of Louisbourg, erected on Ile Royale, now Cape Breton Island, to monitor the Gulf of St. Lawrence, became a significant issue. Its strategic position made it the keystone of French defense in North America, as it allowed for the protection of Atlantic fishing and maintaining a vital link with the metropolis. In 1745, the British launched an expedition against Louisbourg. The New England colonists, supported by the Royal Navy, managed to storm the fortress. This resounding victory shook the French confidence in the solidity of its fortifications, and more broadly, in its ability to effectively defend its North American possessions. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Battle of Fontenoy, fought in 1745 in the Austrian Netherlands, dealt a serious setback to the British Army and its allies, as the French troops, under the command of Marshal de Saxe, achieved a notable success. Thus, the conflict sometimes turned to France's advantage in Europe, but the situation remained more fragile on the colonial front. Finally, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 ended the War of the Austrian Succession. Louisbourg is returned to France in exchange for Madras, which the French East India Company had previously conquered in India. However, this compromise does not dispel the rivalries. It only postpones the inevitable clash of interests.
We're praying for. Make it right.
In India, despite the return of Madras, the rivalry continues almost unabated. Dupleix pursues his policy of influence in the Deccan and the Carnatic. He militarily supports friendly local rulers in order to counter British advances. Under his direction, the French army and its indigenous allies even achieve important victories, which raises concerns in London. In response, the British East India Company doubles its efforts, strengthening its forces and forming alliances with princes more inclined to oppose French influence. Robert Clive, initially a clerk and then a captain in the company, distinguished himself through his daring raids and did not hesitate to use secret diplomacy to rally local support. The rivalries among governors, nabobs, and other local potentates offer fertile ground for foreign interventions, and this instability often benefits the power that can maneuver the most effectively. The definitive break comes with the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, a global conflict that pits France, supported by Austria and various allies, against England, allied with Prussia. This conflict is sometimes considered the first truly global war, due to the geographical scope of the battles and the multitude of crisscrossed alliances. In India, the two companies project their forces onto local battlegrounds, each trying in turn to capture strategic towns and resources. Dupleix is recalled to France in 1754, and his successor fails to maintain his Indian alliances on the same scale. The British, better financed, expand their dominance, particularly in Bengal, while the French position gradually erodes. On the North American continent, the 7 Years' War crystallizes in several decisive campaigns. The French garrisons in Canada strive to contain the push of British forces, supported by a significant fleet and the militias of nearby colonies. In 1759, General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, commander of French troops in Canada, confronts the armies of Major General James Wolfe during the famous Battle of the Plains of Abraham on the outskirts of Quebec City. This confrontation results in the death of both commanders, but victory goes to the English, who quickly capture the capital of New France. The year 1759 is even dubbed Annus Mirabilis for England, as it achieves major successes on several fronts. British naval forces dominate the Atlantic, crushing French competition both in the Caribbean and off European coasts, while land troops advance on Canadian soil. The fall of Quebec hastens the end of New France, even though resistance continues for a time in Montreal and in forts further upstream. However, the resources of the mother country are dwindling. The French Navy, forced to face the dominant Royal Navy, cannot effectively resupply its overseas positions. Reinforcement attempts sent from the Hexagon are regularly intercepted at sea. Meanwhile, in Europe, the war rages on France, supports Austria against Prussia, while Great Britain massively finances the military effort of Frederick II of Prussia. After a few years of this generalized conflict, exhaustion looms over each camp. Peace negotiations begin in order to halt the spiral of military expenditures and stabilize imperial possessions. The Treaty of Paris, finally signed in 1763, marked British supremacy in several regions of the globe. France had to cede practically all of New France to England, except for a few islands off the coast of Newfoundland, kept for fishing purposes, and retained Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, as well as some trading posts in India, but only for commercial purposes and without fortifications. The vast French Mississippi basin practically disappeared from the map, except for western Louisiana, transferred to Spain as compensation for the loss of Florida, taken by the British. On the Indian subcontinent, France lost most of its expansion ambitions, retaining only a few symbolic trading posts, and could no longer seriously compete with the British East India Company. This peace agreement drastically reduced the extent of the French colonial empire and inaugurated the era of British naval dominance, reinforced by a modern fleet widely deployed across several oceans. From a financial standpoint, the victory was not without consequences for the British. The 7 Years' War, particularly costly, left England with a considerable debt. To repay it, London chose to tax its colonies in North America more heavily. The new impositions, such as the Stamp Act of 1765, created strong discontent among the colonists, conducive to the emergence of protest movements. Nevertheless, as of 1763, no major uprising had yet erupted, and Great Britain, basking in its sense of power, savored the triumph achieved over France. Geopolitically, this victory confirmed the decisive shift towards Anglo-Saxon domination over maritime and trade routes, paving the way for an additional century of rivalries and shifting alliances, where France would attempt to regain its place on the world stage. In the mid-1770s, the 13 colonies of North America began an open rebellion against the British Crown, fueled by rising fiscal and political tensions. The colonists, gathered within the Second Continental Congress from 1775, declared they were fighting for their rights, even for their independence. At the same time, France, then governed by Louis XVI, observed the situation with growing attention. Various royal advisors saw in this conflict an opportunity to take revenge on England for the defeats suffered during the 7 Years' War. Despite initial hesitations to officially help Republican insurgents, a move that could ideologically seem contradictory to monarchical absolutism, France quickly discerned strategic advantages, weakening the British maritime and commercial power while reaffirming its place on the international scene. However, as the kingdom could not immediately engage in a frontal conflict against England, it first chose the unofficial path of supplying weapons and ammunition, and then committed more concretely after the American victory at Saratoga in 1777. From 1775, the young Marquis Gilbert du Motier, better known as Lafayette, was captivated by the insurgents' cause. From a noble Auvergnat family, orphaned of his father, and driven by a keen sense of chivalry, he decided to rally the American army to bring his supposed experience and enthusiasm. In the context of Franco-British rivalry, the project of emigrating across the Atlantic remained risky. Despite attempts by the court to dissuade him, Lafayette left in 1777 and quickly became one of the most prominent French officers in the ranks of the Continental Army. His arrival was welcomed by General George Washington, who regarded him almost as an adopted son. For Lafayette, his fight went beyond the mere desire to confront England. He had a genuine admiration for the concept of independence and the burgeoning ideals of political freedom. His role, often symbolic, nonetheless contributed to strengthening Franco-American ties. In parallel, clandestine support activities are organized. As early as 1776, the fictitious company Rodrigue Hortales et Compagnie set up with the help of the playwright and adventurer Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, delivered rifles, gunpowder, and uniforms to the rebels. This discreet aid was largely financed by the French government, eager to test the robustness of the American resistance before officially committing. Gradually, France's involvement could no longer be limited to unofficial support. The British setbacks at Saratoga in 1777 convinced Vergennes, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that the time had come to conclude a clear alliance with the Continental Congress. In February 1778, the Franco-American Alliance Treaty was signed. France formally recognized the independence of the United States and committed itself militarily against Great Britain. The arrival of France in the war disrupted British strategy. Since the beginning of the conflict, London deployed its forces on several fronts. First in North America, where the army had to face the insurgents over thousands of kilometers, then in the Caribbean, where Great Britain and France were at odds over the sugar-rich islands. Finally, the Indian theater remained crucial for the British Crown, which sought to secure its possessions against European rivals, notably French and Dutch. When France engaged directly, the Royal Navy had to prepare to face the French fleet not only off the American coasts, but also in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the tropical waters of the Antilles. This dispersion of British efforts, coupled with the eventual appearance of the Spanish Navy, Spain joined France in 1779, created considerable pressure on London's naval power. French military support was strengthened from 1779. New officers joined the American forces, while the French army began planning a major ground intervention. Orchestrated by Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, this cooperation took a concrete form in 1780 when the 1st Expeditionary Division was sent to the American continent. Rochambeau, an experienced officer well aware of logistical difficulties, established a solid link with George Washington. He showed tact and humility, always seeking to integrate his own troops into American plans, rather than imposing a Eurocentric vision. The French regiments, more seasoned and better trained, provided not only strategic support, but also a strong symbol. The oldest monarchy in Europe was actively supporting a distant revolution aspiring to autonomy and the right to self-determination. At sea, the involvement of the French fleet under the command of the Comte de Grasse became decisive in 1781. François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, a renowned admiral, was sent to the Antilles to protect the French islands and simultaneously threaten the British positions in this region. Aware of the decisive potential of a naval battle, de Grasse coordinated his movements with Rochambeau and Washington. He moved up to Chesapeake Bay on the American East Coast and intercepted the Royal Navy. His naval victory at the Battle of the Virginia Capes, also known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, in September 1781, prevented any British evacuation or resupply by sea in the Yorktown, Virginia area. Thanks to this temporary maritime control, the Anglo-Saxon army commanded by General Charles Cornwallis found itself surrounded. Washington and Rochambeau took advantage of this to launch the siege of Yorktown. During this siege, the Franco-American troops dug approach lines and gradually reduced the English fortifications. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The capitulation marked a real turning point in the War of Independence, as it proved that the most powerful European army could be defeated when the insurgents were supported by a well-coordinated coalition. The defeat at Yorktown exacerbates the exhaustion of the British war effort, already weakened by the multiplication of fronts. In the Caribbean, England must protect itself, not only against the French, but also against the Spanish, who are attempting to recover Gibraltar and strengthen their colonial empire. In India, the East India Company must maintain its supremacy in the face of skirmishes, fomented or supported by French interests. These tensions, compounded by the stagnant American conflict, weigh heavily on the British economy. The expenditures, in both men and money, prove unsustainable in the long term. In London, the government finds itself facing an increasingly critical parliamentary opposition, influenced by voices calling for the end of this costly war. Peace negotiations begin at the start of 1782, in a complex climate where each side seeks to preserve its assets as best as possible. For France, the primary goal is not so much to obtain direct concessions on American soil, but to recover certain colonial possessions lost in previous conflicts and to reaffirm its political credibility. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in September 1783, clearly reflects this desire for revenge, even if its concrete results are mixed. France notably regains Tobago, a Caribbean island with potentially lucrative sugar production, as well as part of Senegal in West Africa. These territories, although small, carry symbolic weight because they mark the restitution of some important positions that France had lost to England. For the French monarchy, it is a moral compensation following the 7 Years' War, but the financial outcome of this intervention proves burdensome. The successive loans to support the army and navy increased the kingdom's debt, already significant at the end of Louis XV's reign. The sense of having restored national prestige is thus confronted with economic reality and poorly assuages the growing debt, unknowingly preparing the ground for future revolutionary upheavals within France itself. From an ideological standpoint, France's intervention in the War of Independence also opens a door to the spread of new political ideas. The French who served on the American continent, whether officers like Lafayette or ordinary soldiers in search of adventure, returned to France with memories of a society forging its own democratic institutions. This absorption of Republican ideals progresses gradually, fueled by the example of a constitution in development across the Atlantic. Moreover, the conflict also sees some English volunteers, often members of the Whig Party in favor of liberal reforms, secretly going to assist the insurgents. Upon their return, they bring back accounts extolling American freedom and highlight alternative political models. These narratives circulate both in intellectual circles and in London parliamentary milieus, discreetly laying the groundwork for future reform policies. The fermentation of ideas spreads even further. Ireland, under Anglo-Norman influence since the 12th century, remains a territory under the domination of the British Crown. A segment of the population, notably Catholics, suffers from legal and economic discrimination. During the American War of Independence, some Irish expressed their sympathy for the revolting colonists, seeing them as an example of the struggle against London's control. Once the conflict ends, revolutionary inspiration circulates within Irish intellectual circles. The Society of United Irishmen emerges in the 1790s, gathering patriots eager to achieve independence, or at least a broad autonomy from the United Kingdom. Its founders are profoundly influenced by the American Declaration of Independence and, from another angle, by the upheavals occurring in France starting in 1789. This society nurtures a dream to abolish religious barriers and unite Catholics and Protestants around a common cause, advocating equality and a break with a central power deemed oppressive. The process remains discreet in the 1780s, but gradually intensifies, spurred by the circulation of political pamphlets and the echo of French events. In late 18th century England, where the parliamentary monarchy is consolidating, the Irish question is not entirely ignored. London is aware that the American War has emboldened various separatist or autonomist movements within its empire. However, the priority for the British government remains to curb expenses and heal the wounds of the transatlantic conflict. The troubles manifest as much on the political front, with heated debates in Parliament, as on the social level, with a population burdened by the taxes following the war. The merchant class, which might have rejoiced in British domination over major trade routes, fears new taxes to fill the deficit and struggles with the competition posed by other powers, especially a resurging France. In this context, Ireland remains a potentially explosive hotbed, but not a priority until the first outbreaks of insurrection in the coming decades. On the French side, the contribution to the American insurgents' victory seems, at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, a diplomatic and military triumph. It offers the monarchy a renewed prestige. Yet, behind the scenes, the enormous expenditures for the war, purchases of ships, troops, salaries, subsidies to the Americans, maintenance of naval bases, etc., have shaken the royal finances. Louis XVI's ministers face a daunting challenge: how to reform an archaic tax system to absorb the weight of the debt. Proposed measures, such as taxing the privileged orders or creating new taxes, raise resistance among the nobility and high clergy. The parliaments, jealous of their privileges, frequently oppose reforms that threaten their prerogatives. Already one can perceive, in the background, the beginnings of the institutional crisis that, a few years later, will lead to the convening of the Estates General and the revolutionary explosion of 1789. In the wake of the American victory and the treaties concluded in 1783, The French monarchy, nevertheless, strives to project a radiant image. The presence of Lafayette on the public scene, a young transatlantic hero, reinforces this sense of accomplishment. The courage and gallantry of the Count de Rochambeau, the dexterity of Admiral de Grasse, the solidity of the logistical support provided by the royal intendants are praised. European gazettes report the astonishing coalition between an ancient monarchy and an insurgent people. In Parisian salons, conversations revolve around the new American Republic, its founders, and the birth of unprecedented political principles on a continental scale. Republican ideas are taking hold, both in military elites and some enlightened circles. The paradox lies in the fact that the same monarchy that promoted this struggle in America will soon face similar demands on its own soil. Meanwhile, in Great Britain, the feeling of humiliation caused by the loss of the American colonies mingles with a reflection on the kingdom's ability to maintain its vast colonial territories. Administrative reforms in the empire, notably in India, are being studied, aiming to strengthen the crown's authority while reassuring the settlers about their rights. England emerges weakened from the war, but far from ruined. It retains the most powerful navy in the world and significant commercial resources. Its politicians, perceptive, will gradually learn lessons from this failure and adjust their strategy, allowing it to rebound in the following decades. However, in the immediate future, the impact of military expenditures weighs on the British taxpayer, while France celebrates the reconquest of its honor. Tobago, Senegal, diplomatic satisfaction. All this responds to the national pride wounded since the 7 Years' War. Many see in this success the confirmation that France remains a significant European power, capable of serious rivals against England. The stocks of weapons, tactical developments, and standardization efforts have advanced French military expertise and strengthened cohesion among officers. As an indirect consequence, esteem for the Army and Navy rises, contributing to the emergence of a more pronounced national pride. During the same period, the circulation of political writings encourages questioning of the established order. Translations of American texts, such as the Declaration of Independence or some state constitutions, are published, and passionate debates occur about individual liberties, the role of parliamentary representation, and the separation of powers. Pro-Whig Englishmen, having returned from their symbolic participation in the conflict or influenced by the rhetoric of American patriots, also spread liberal ideas. In several London clubs, discussions focus on the relevance of reforms to avoid future revolts and maintain the allegiance of the remaining colonies. The Irish, for their part, draw from this ideological pool in hopes of overturning the balance of power. And in France, the growing divide between royal absolutism and these new democratic aspirations foreshadows an inevitable clash. The period of the French Revolutionary Wars, beginning in 1792, reconfigures the geopolitical balance of Europe and extends to the far edges of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The young republic, born from the collapse of the monarchy, faces a concert of coalition powers, with the United Kingdom, then master of the seas, leading the pack. Between 1792 and 1802, revolutionary France strives to fend off these multiple threats while pursuing the objective of exporting its ideals. On the continent, the British, Austrians, and Prussians form the coalition of 1793 to contain French advances. At sea, the Royal Navy seeks to suffocate the enemy by cutting its trade links, while France organizes mass mobilization and undertakes bold expeditions. Within this vast 1793 coalition, the United Kingdom, the main maritime adversary, coordinates its naval forces with its allies. The port areas of Spithead, on the southern coast of England and the Gulf of Quebec in the North Atlantic, reflect the desire to establish a global naval deployment. The British aim to secure their trade routes and encircle France. Despite their superiority, the Royal Navy experiences increasing internal tensions. Mutinies break out in Spithead in April 1797 and spread to other naval bases. Sailors revolt against the harshness of discipline, insufficient wages, and lack of comfort on the ships. The British authorities, fearing the weakening of their most precious military tool, negotiate with the mutineers to restore order. This episode reveals a crack in the monolith of English naval power, although the Royal Navy quickly regains its cohesion and maintains a vigorous operational pace. On the French side, the convention decrees the levée en masse, a conscription mechanism that enrolls large numbers of troops. The desire to defend the revolutionary homeland boosts troop morale. While the coalition armies hope for a quick crush of the Republic, France puts up an unexpected resistance. The land borders, particularly in the north and east, are consolidated through successive battles and reorganizations. Armament workshops, stimulated by patriotic enthusiasm, produce cannons, rifles, and ammunition at an increased rate. Simultaneously, Paris monitors its generals, some of whom are former royal officers who might be prone to scheming. This delicate balance nonetheless allows the Revolutionary Army to gain ground in the Netherlands and threaten certain German regions of the Holy Roman Empire, weakening the coalition on the continent. To strike at the heart of the British Empire, the Republic plans an expedition to Egypt. The objective is to cut off the route to India, essential to English trade, and to challenge British supremacy in the East. In May 1798, General Napoleon Bonaparte leads a fleet from Toulon carrying soldiers, but also scientists and engineers tasked with studying Egypt's resources. After a brief stop in Malta, the French army lands in Alexandria in early July. On land, the campaign is marked by initial successes, such as the Battle of the Pyramids, where the Mamluk cavalry is brutally defeated. Bonaparte then hopes to move towards the Levant and disrupt British interests while establishing a lasting base in the Nile Valley. This ambition, however, is thwarted by the Royal Navy, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson. On August 1st, 1798, the Battle of the Nile ends with the near-complete destruction of the French fleet in Aboukir Bay. The nighttime attack by British ships takes the French by surprise, who are positioned too close to the shore. The flagship, L'Orient, spectacularly explodes during the battles. Deprived of maritime support, the French army finds itself isolated in Egypt, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies from the metropolis. While Bonaparte continues the land campaign and tries to advance towards Syria, his strategic isolation hinders his plans. Meanwhile, England can now focus more resources on reinforcing the maritime blockade around the French coasts and protecting its own colonies. On another front, France aims to support the Republican movements in Ireland, a country under British Crown rule for centuries. Religious and political tensions are high, particularly between the Catholic majority and the Anglican authorities. The Irish Patriots of the Society of United Irishmen call for help to shake off the English yoke. In December 1796, a French fleet leaves Brest under the command of General Lazare Hoche to land in Western Ireland. Unfortunately, violent storms scatter the ships. The bad weather, combined with the vigilance of the British Navy, prevents the establishment of a proper expeditionary force. The French contingents never land on Irish soil in sufficient numbers, and the operation ends in confusion.
I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
A new attempt occurs in 1798. This time, some French troops land near Killala, seeking to support a local insurrection. The initial battles fuel hopes of a general uprising against the crown. However, the British reaction is swift and massive, while the Irish popular momentum does not garner enough supporters to change the balance of power. The French reinforcements, too few in number, find themselves surrounded. The failure of this venture demonstrates that English naval superiority makes any distant intervention extremely complicated for France, which struggles to maintain supply lines at sea. The Irish patriots, despite their determination, do not receive the decisive support that would have allowed them to shake British authority beyond a few isolated skirmishes. In the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, the Franco-British rivalry translates into privateering missions and an enhanced control of trade routes. The British, aware of their logistical advantage, perfect the use of flag signals. This system of coded instructions allows dispersed fleets to react quickly in case of threat. The signal manuals, constantly updated, offer the Admiralty better coordination among squadrons. Commanders can thus regroup and protect their convoys or set up ambushes. For its part, France relies on bases like the island of today Mauritius and Bourbon Island, Reunion Island, to disrupt British freight heading to India. Skirmishes in these remote regions, although important for trade, struggle to alter the overall situation. The continental blockade imposed by the coalition gradually isolates the Republic, which must focus its forces on European land theaters. At the turn of the century, France has won several major victories in Central Europe. Austria and Prussia, beaten and weakened, temporarily conclude armistices that reduce the coalition's reach. Bonaparte, having returned from Egypt in 1799, takes advantage of these successes to orchestrate the coup d'état of 18 Brumaire that establishes him as first consul. He then undertakes a restructuring of the French administration and military apparatus. The forces, sourced from conscription, give France a numerical advantage on land, while the Royal Navy maintains its dominance at sea. The British continue to finance the war thanks to revenues from global trade and the support of public opinion, concerned about seeing France conquer most of continental Europe.
I have Robin and I'm listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
At the beginning of 1802, both sides were yearning for a respite. The British, although dominating at sea, were unable to deliver a decisive blow to France on the continent. On the other hand, the French government needed to stabilize the Republic and consolidate its conquests. Negotiations led to the Peace of Amiens, signed in March 1802. This agreement marked the first significant break in the war for nearly 10 years. The signatories planned certain territorial restitutions and at least a temporary end to hostilities. The British agreed to evacuate Malta, while France consented to abandon some colonial possessions. However, this treaty did not resolve the underlying ambitions. Bonaparte used this truce to strengthen the consular regime. Conscription was solidified, the army reorganized, and the national economy received an indispensable boost. On their side, the Royal Navy further perfected its organization, aware that peace might be short-lived. The shipyards of England were busy modernizing the ships of the line and improving the onboard artillery. The signal systems, tested during the Battle of the Nile, became a model of communication for other European navies. Senior officers, trained at the School of Great Admirals, cultivated tactical precision and insisted on maneuverability, a know-how that would make the difference in future naval battles. The funds obtained through loans and trade taxes allowed London to maintain a high level of alert. Many suspected that confrontation would resume, as ideological and territorial antagonisms had continued to grow since 1792. In 1803, after the brief lull of the Peace of Amiens, tensions between Napoleonic France and Great Britain resumed. Napoleon Bonaparte, who proclaimed himself Emperor of the French in 1804, found himself faced with a maritime power determined to prevent him from extending his influence across the continent. The conflict took on a new dimension. Previous revolutionary wars gave way to a confrontation of both military and economic scales. In response to French land victories, London sought to maintain its naval supremacy and orchestrate coalitions with European monarchies. In response, Napoleon decreed a vast system, the Continental Blockade, aimed at economically strangling Great Britain by cutting off its access to continental ports. British merchants, deprived of outlets, were supposedly forced to bring their government to its knees. However, the actual effects of the blockade proved more complex than expected. Smuggling flourished, Russia and other territories weakened the arrangement, and the Royal Navy still controlled most of the sea routes. This economic struggle undermined diplomatic relations across Europe and reshaped the map of alliances, as French pressure on various kingdoms to close their ports to the English sparked profound discontent. In fact, sovereigns reluctant to obey Paris's orders eventually allied with Great Britain, fueling the spirit of coalition against Napoleon. The naval theater would quickly create a major turning point. As early as 1805, Napoleon planned an invasion of England, convinced that if the French army could cross the Channel, the British government might collapse. To do this, he ordered the concentration of the French and Spanish fleets to deceive the English navy and temporarily achieve superiority at sea. But this strategy ran up against the skill of British Admiral Horatio Nelson, who tracked the Franco-Spanish squadrons and forced them to retreat. On October 21, 1805, off Cape Trafalgar, the decisive battle resulted in Nelson's death during the engagement, but also in the effective destruction of the French and Spanish fleets as an operational force. This victory cemented the Royal Navy's uncontested domination. Any attempt to invade England was now abandoned, while Great Britain ensured control of access to the oceans. This heroic success had a considerable impact on the British collective memory, reinforcing the determination to continue the fight against Napoleon until his defeat. On land, however, the imperial power of France unfolds with a series of resounding victories. Austerlitz in December 1805, Jena in 1806, Friedland in 1807. These triumphs allow Napoleon to reshape the map of Central Europe and dissolve or transform ancient states into vassal entities. Despite the loss of his fleet, Napoleon hopes to compel continental nations to adhere to the blockade. He forces Austria and Prussia to sign treaties that involve closing their markets to British goods. Similarly, in 1807, Tsar Alexander I's Imperial Russia concludes the Peace of Tilsit, seemingly, at first, complying with the Napoleonic system. However, strategic rivalries and latent dissensions soon resurface, and some states gradually begin to extract themselves from the economic control imposed by France, sensing that the British Kingdom, despite the continental stranglehold, remains the hub of global trade. In this context, the Iberian Peninsula becomes the next crucial battlefield, as it concentrates the confrontation between the French Empire, the Spanish Patriots, and Great Britain seeking a new front to weaken Napoleon. The Spanish War, often called the Peninsular War, truly begins in 1808, when Napoleon intervenes in the Spanish dynastic quarrel to attempt to place his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Madrid. The Spanish opposition quickly organizes around local juntas that rally the population against the French occupier. The British, under the leadership of General Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, see in this blaze a means to wear down the forces of the emperor. The rugged Sierras, the awakened Spanish national sentiment, and the multiplication of small guerrillas transformed this conflict into a true quagmire for France. The Napoleonic army is no longer in open terrain where its classic maneuvers dominate. It faces sporadic attacks and fierce resistance, which exhaust it in both men and resources. The Spanish partisans, supported by British and Portuguese reinforcements, inflict defeat after defeat on the imperial troops, while Wellington refines his defensive tactics and gradually captures the bastions occupied by the French, notably after the Battle of Talavera in 1809, and in subsequent engagements like Salamanca in 1812 and Vittoria in 1813. This war, longer than Napoleon had anticipated, deprives the emperor of a valuable portion of his army, forcing him to strip other fronts to fuel a conflict that seems endless. At the same time, Napoleon's foreign policy has grown more complex. Tsar Alexander I, exasperated by the harmful effects of the continental blockade on the Russian economy and unhappy with the European redrawing imposed by France, decides to draw closer to Great Britain. In 1812, weary of seeing Russia escape commercial constraints and fearing the formation of a new coalition, Napoleon embarks on the disastrous Russian campaign. This severely weakens the ranks of the Grand Army. The Russian winter, logistical difficulties, and the scorched earth tactics employed by the Russians obliterate the Napoleonic force, which had over 600,000 men at the outset. Those who return from Moscow are in reduced number, demoralized, and deprived of the majority of their equipment. In this context of resounding failure, the European powers, encouraged by London, reconstitute leagues against the empire. Prussia and Austria join Russia in its revenge, while the British strengthen their lines in Spain, ready to cross the Pyrenees to bring the war into France. In 1813, the Grand Coalition took shape as the Sixth Coalition against Napoleon. The Saxon campaigns culminated in the gigantic Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations, which took place from October 16th to 19th, 1813. The coalition forces, comprised of Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes, led by generals coordinated under the aegis of London diplomacy and the determination of Austrian Chancellor Metternich, dealt a crushing defeat to Napoleon's army. This Battle of Leipzig sealed the end of Napoleon's hegemony in Germany. From then on, the coalition troops advanced toward France, aware of the worn state in which the imperial forces found themselves. On the Spanish front, Wellington was already on the verge of pushing the last French contingents north of the Pyrenees, facilitating the invasion of French soil from the south. The imperial forces, caught in a vice, could not contain the progression of multiple enemy armies on several strategic directions at once. Despite some defensive French victories during the campaign in France in 1814, the emperor was forced to abdicate in April of the same year. Exiled on the island of Elba, Napoleon nonetheless managed, to general astonishment, to escape and retake power in France during the period known as the 100 Days, starting in March 1815. The European monarchs, gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw post-Napoleonic Europe, mobilized immediately. The British entrusted Wellington with the mission of assembling a new army. They allied once again with Prussia, led by Field Marshal Blücher, to confront the emperor, who returned to the arena. By mid-June 1815, Napoleon attempted to preempt the concentration of allies in Belgium, hoping to win two separate battles against each of them. After some initial successes like Ligny, he found himself compelled to face Wellington's army near the village of Waterloo, while the Prussians, defeated but not annihilated, reorganized to support the English troops. On June 18, 1815, under a rainy sky that delayed French attacks and rendered the ground muddy, the decisive Battle of Waterloo sealed Napoleon's fate. The French cavalry, led by Marshal Ney, failed to break through the enemy lines. The famous British squares held firm, and the arrival of Prussian reinforcements in the late afternoon overwhelmed the Imperial Army. The disorder was total, marking the definitive end of Napoleonic ambitions. The victorious coalition, diplomatically and financially driven from London, imposed new conditions on France. Napoleon, seeking to flee to the United States, ultimately surrendered to the British and was exiled this time to St. Helena, an isolated island in the South Atlantic, where he remained until his death in 1821. France, for its part, faced Allied occupation and signed the Second Treaty of Paris in November 1815. The terms of this treaty restored French borders to those of 1790, before the major revolutionary and imperial expansions. The victorious powers, wary, maintained a military presence on French territory to ensure stability and prevent any new return of the emperor or his supporters. The costs of this occupation weighed heavily on the finances of the state, exhausted by more than 2 decades of almost uninterrupted wars. As the Congress of Vienna endeavored to restore traditional monarchies to their thrones and re-establish balance among the great powers, the Franco-British relationship remained full of mistrust. Both nations were marked by the profound traumas of this long revolutionary and imperial period. Great Britain, strengthened in its role as master of the seas, now controlled global trade flows. France, short of soldiers and resources, had definitively lost its aura of conquest. Its neighbors, now coalesced, watched to prevent it from regaining its former domination. Returned to a constitutional monarchy under Louis XVI, France felt under surveillance in a European order dominated by the financial and naval power of the British, with no immediate prospect of regaining the lost ascendancy. The collective memory in France and Great Britain is thus constructed around this epic struggle, maintained by contradictory narratives. On one side, the Napoleonic epic, fascinating to some for its heroic dimension and its immense reforms. On the other, the assertion of a well-deserved English triumph, the result of tenacity and naval superiority. Despite the desire to ease tensions, the impression that the two countries cannot really get along persists. Colonial, economic, and diplomatic disputes continue even after 1815, and the obsession to prevent France from becoming a threat again is ingrained in the British doctrine of the coming century. Allied occupation insists on the necessity of permanent control, while France harbors feelings of humiliation and latent revenge. The Second Treaty of Paris, however, extinguishes the last hope of a contemporary French imperial expansion to the Revolutionary Wars. The coalition rulers have imposed the restoration of the old dynasties and a new system of European balance in which no continental power should be able to challenge Great Britain on land and sea. The landscape resulting from 1815 is thus one of a France reintegrated into the concert of nations, but watched by a Europe fearing new turbulence. The accumulated resentments, the fear of returning to war, and unresolved tensions shape a climate where mistrust dominates, a prelude to future rivalries. In the aftermath of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, France and the United Kingdom, freshly out of the Napoleonic Wars, find themselves in a precarious balance where each seeks to reaffirm its power. Both countries have rapidly growing economic needs, fueled by quick industrialization and mercantile ambitions. The United Kingdom, already well advanced in the Industrial Revolution, wants to establish its control over a global maritime network, assured by a considerable fleet. France, on its part, seeks to rebuild a colonial empire capable of compensating for British influence and restoring lost prestige after Napoleon's fall. The commercial, diplomatic, and sometimes military rivalries will express themselves in several regions of the globe, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. In Africa, the competition between the two powers intensifies by the mid-19th century. France launches its expedition in Algeria in 1830 under the reign of Charles VI, citing diplomatic and commercial reasons. This conquest marks the starting point of a direct French presence in North Africa. Over the decades, the French army, supported by the colonial administration, attempts to pacify and extend its control over the entire Algerian territory, whose resistance, led notably by Emir Abdelkader, proves tenacious. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom consolidates its position in Egypt more indirectly, initially through trade, then by extending financial loans to Egyptian rulers. The British do not immediately implant themselves as a colonial force in Egypt, but closely monitor any developments likely to favor their own access to the Red Sea and the route to India. Further west, France projects its influence in Senegal, where from the 1840s, it establishes trading posts on the Atlantic coast. This is the beginning of an extended enterprise which, gradually, aims at the interior lands of West Africa. Explorers like René Caillié or military administrators such as Louis Faidherbe push the frontiers of the French colonial empire towards present-day Mali and build forts to establish Paris's authority. On its side, the United Kingdom extends its presence on the Gold Coast, now Ghana and Nigeria, relying on the Royal Navy and commercial companies to deprive France of easy outlets in certain strategic coastal areas. Protestant missionary missions, often supported by British funding, seek to convert the local populations and extend the Anglo-Saxon sphere of influence. This intention to implant the British language, religion, and administrative organization permanently sometimes conflicts with the Catholic missionary efforts coming from France. In the northeast of the continent, the Egyptian occupation of Sudan allows Great Britain to observe with interest the connection between Egypt and Central Africa. Control of this area is potentially crucial for the route to India, as the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean remain essential passageways for British trade. Conversely, France desires to link its West African empire to the Nile Valley to form a vast territorial bloc capable of competing with the English axis connecting Cairo to the Cape, an informal project of an Anglo-Saxon continuity from north to south of the continent. French explorers' expeditions, such as those of Savourignan de Bratza in the Congo, add to the mutual distrust, with each fearing that the other will seize a strategic territory without negotiation. In Asia, the colonial dynamic presents equally marked divergences. The United Kingdom consolidates its Indian empire during the 19th century, following the expansionist policy of the East India Company. Since the Mysore Wars at the end of the 18th century, the English have swept away French competition in the subcontinent. In the 19th century, they continued to extend their control through treaties imposed on local rulers and by suppressing major revolts, such as the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, which results in the full subjection of India under the British Crown starting in 1858. France, which was initially ousted from this area, turns to other opportunities in Southeast Asia. From the 1860s, under the impetus of Napoleon III, it begins the conquest of Cochinchina in the south of present-day Vietnam, then extends to Cambodia and Tonkin, gradually creating French Indochina. The maritime rivalries between Paris and London are also evident in the desire to control trade routes to the major Asian markets, notably via strategic straits like the Strait of Malacca. In the Pacific, the race for influence is expressed more diffusely, as the islands are vast and sparsely populated, but strategically important for long-haul navigation. France establishes itself in New Caledonia in 1853, opens a protectorate in Tahiti and French Polynesia, and tries to secure supply routes for its military ships. The United Kingdom, on its part, strengthens its hegemony in Australia, a settlement colony since 1788, and in New Zealand, where the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 authorizes it to extend its sovereignty. French ambitions in Polynesia regularly provoke diplomatic protests from London, which fears seeing its regional stronghold reduced. The economic stakes are lower than on the Asian or African continent, but the prestige and the desire not to let a competitor occupy useful anchorage points greatly motivate these insular expansions. Among the major crises, the Suez Canal question occupies a central place. Constructed under the leadership of the engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, a Frenchman who obtained the endorsement of Egypt's Viceroy Said Pasha, the canal is inaugurated in 1869. Its commissioning revolutionizes navigation between Europe and Asia by significantly shortening the journey to the Indian Ocean and the China Sea. France holds significant shares in the Suez Company, but finds itself in financial difficulty in the 1870s, particularly after the 1870 war against Prussia. The debt of Egypt, then led by Khedive Ismail Pasha, leads to the forced sale of Egyptian shares in the Canal Company to Great Britain in 1875, under the impetus of British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Thus, London gains a dominant position over this strategic maritime passage. For France, it is a painful diplomatic blow, as it had initiated the project, only to see its rival control the main artery linking Europe to Asia. English influence in Egypt will quickly translate, starting in 1882, into a direct military and administrative presence in Cairo, formalizing the British protectorate. This domination over the Suez Canal solidifies the English mastery of the India route and places France in an awkward position in the Levant. While control of the canal consolidates the British Empire, French interest shifts towards the interior of Africa. The colonial ambitions of Jules Ferry, head of government of the Third Republic in the 1880s, revived the conquest of West Africa. France establishes important bases there, gradually connecting Senegal, French Sudan, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire. Temporary agreements with the United Kingdom, setting theoretical boundaries, do not always cover the reality on the ground. French troops progress eastward, hoping to reach the Nile and secure a symbolic access to the Red Sea. The British, on their part, consolidate their corridor from Egypt to Kenya, then further south to the Cape. This confrontation crystallizes in the Fashoda incident in 1898. The French mission, led by Commander Jean-Baptiste Marchand, coming from French Congo, arrives at Fashoda, today's Kodok in South Sudan, with the stated aim of signing treaties with local chiefs and raising the French flag over this locality on the Nile. The British, for their part, dispatch an expedition led by Herbert Kitchener, victorious at Omdurman against the Mahdists. The two delegations find themselves face-to-face at Fashoda in an atmosphere of great tension. The fear of an open-armed conflict is real, as neither government wishes to cede ground. Eventually, in the fall of 1898, faced with British numerical and logistical superiority, France resolves to order Marchand to evacuate the area, thus avoiding a direct confrontation that could have escalated into a European war. This event symbolizes the peak of the Franco-British colonial rivalry in sub-Saharan Africa, each country defending its interests ardently, but leaders understanding the risk of triggering a major conflict in Europe. Many believe that, in different circumstances, Fashoda could have provoked a war between France and the United Kingdom, so intense was the tension. However, diplomacy ultimately prevails, and the Fashoda crisis, becomes the reference point prompting both governments to better coordinate in the future. The turn of the century is marked by a shift in power balances. Germany, unified since 1871, emerges as a formidable commercial, industrial, and military force. The German Second Reich, led by Wilhelm II, multiplies investments in the war navy and seeks territories to colonize. German ambitions in Africa, Togo, Cameroon, Namibia in the Pacific, Mariana Islands, Carolines, or in China, Qingdao Concession, create a climate of concern in London and Paris. To address this new state of affairs, the British and French governments begin to consider that an agreement is necessary to counter possible German expansionism. Secret talks open around unresolved colonial issues, while in the Court of London and at the presidency of the French Republic, efforts are made to smooth over age-old disputes. In 1904, the signing of the Entente Cordiale marks a decisive diplomatic turning point. This agreement, negotiated under the impetus of British King Edward VII and French President Émile Loubet, mainly aims to settle the remaining colonial conflicts between the two nations. In the texts, there are provisions regarding Morocco and Egypt. France recognizes the British preponderance over Egyptian administration, while the United Kingdom admits the French sphere of influence in Morocco, paving the way for the 1912 protectorate. The divergences in other parts of the world, such as Asia or the Pacific, are also smoothed over. In exchange for minor concessions, France obtains the guarantee that Great Britain will no longer intervene against its territorial interests in North Africa. London, for its part, now turns its attention to the growing threat of the Kaiserliche Marine, German Imperial Navy, in the North Sea and the global economic competition imposed by Berlin. The scope of the Entente Cordiale goes beyond the simple settlement of colonial conflicts. It is also a mutual recognition of common interests to be preserved against a rising Germany. The agreement, while not immediately creating a formal military alliance, lays the foundations for closer cooperation between Paris and London. Warmer diplomatic exchanges, regular consultations, and first contacts between general staffs facilitate the flow of information on German power. The sense that France and Great Britain have a common potential adversary encourages them to overcome their old grievances. Public opinions, long fed by patriotic discourses justifying colonial conquest, are gradually being prepared for the idea that yesterday's enemy can become tomorrow's ally. French and British newspapers, once inclined to denounce each other's policies, progressively evoke the necessity of making peace to prevent a German hegemony on the continent. Of course, grudges do not disappear overnight, and the hardest nationalist circles, both in France and England, initially view the Entente Cordiale with suspicion. However, international logic and the shared fear of isolation in the face of the Kaiser's ambitions eventually prevail. In this new climate, rapprochement intensifies as French diplomats like Paul Cambon and British diplomats such as Edward Grey hold numerous meetings. Many technical discussions open up between senior officers, notably to determine how to respond in case of foreign aggression. The two countries modernize their armed forces, with France perfecting its artillery and the United Kingdom maintaining its naval supremacy. English financiers sometimes support French loans, while Paris participates in initiatives that strengthen the city as a financial hub. Through this agreement, the colonial rivalry, which had caused tensions, crises, and risks of war for almost a century, finds an official conclusion. Border disputes in Africa are generally resolved. British influence concentrates on Egypt, Sudan, and East Africa, while France affirms its control over West Africa and the Maghreb. In Asia, Indochina remains firmly in the French orbit, while India remains the jewel of the British crown, without open contest from Paris. Island possessions in the Pacific, like Tahiti and New Caledonia for France, or the large Australian colonies for the United Kingdom, are no longer subject to major diplomatic quarrels. This agreement, motivated by the necessity to curb German expansion, also marks the beginning of growing military and diplomatic cooperation. Exchanges of confidential information, the development of hypothetical defense plans in case of European tension, and the strengthening of trans-channel economic ties prefigure a more concrete alliance. When World War I breaks out, the two countries will act side by side, allies in a global conflict whose origins are partly rooted in this rebalancing of European powers. Allies during WW1.